Chapter 12 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Embarrassment of Bauer. Next day the ladies Plone found occasion for one of those dissertations on the shortcomings of servants so dear to the feminine heart. Mr. Hartmann told them that he had been obliged to dismiss his young valet without notice, because of insubordination and impertinence. "I lost my patience and told him to get out of my sight at once," reported the indignant landowner, his soft heart reproaching him all the while for the calumny he was obliged to heap on the head of his faithful Karl. Muller reached his own house in the city exactly at 11 o'clock. He was greeted by his former housekeeper, whom he had recalled as there was now no further reason for secrecy as far as Mrs. Tunner was concerned. The latter seemed so disappointed at the change in the household that the soft-hearted Muller hastened to reassure her. He told her that his home was hers until she could get another good position, or until Karl was able to make a home for himself and his mother. "Is he able to do anything for himself yet?" asked the anxious mother timidly. "It is your kindness alone that gives him the opportunity to be honest, at least." Muller shook his head. "It's not such a great kindness on my part. I need your son, and he is proving himself very useful to me. You need have no anxiety about him, if you have no objection to his following my profession. He may do well at it, if he makes good in this detective work I am now testing him with." "Why should I have any objection to it?" "There are people who do not think highly of the profession." "I am not one of them," replied Mrs. Tunner warmly. "How could I be, now that I know you and what sort of a man you are? It isn't the work that makes the man, but the man that makes or mars the profession he adopts. If Karl should become ever so little like you, I will be proud of him, more proud of him than I thought possible, of late years." "Has he told you that he is going to Russia?" asked Muller, changing the subject. Mrs. Tunner shook her head. "That was wise of him," continued Muller in a tone of approval. "In our profession a man must say as little as possible, even to those who are nearest to him. But there is no harm in your knowing where he is going. If he is away longer than now planned, it will be perfectly safe for him to write you if you wish it." "It shall be just as you think best," said Mrs. Tunner calmly. Muller gave her a slip of paper with a few lines written on it. "In case Karl is not here at the time, I want you to send this telegram to me as soon as you receive one, which I will send you. My message will be a perfectly indifferent one. Let us say something about buying flowers for me. As soon as it comes, get this off at once. And now I want to talk to Karl. Has he come home yet?" "Yes, he came in half an hour ago. Now I understand why he had all that shopping to do." "He had to get ready for his trip. Please have dinner served at 12:30, and order the carriage for 1 o'clock. Muller nodded to Mrs. Tunner and went upstairs to the little room he had assigned to Karl. The door was half open, and the young man sat by the window reading. He was so absorbed in his book that he did not hear Muller's entrance, nor the closing of the door. The detective smiled as if pleased at his protégé's power of concentration, and spoke gently. "George Munzer," was all he said. Karl started and sprang up from his chair. "Oh, Mr. Muller, I didn't hear you come in." "Well, I'm glad to see you know your new name when you hear it," replied Muller with a glance at the book in Karl's hands. "That's right, you know how to go about it, I see," he continued, for the book was the familiar red-covered Baedeker, with the word Russia in gold letters on the cover. Inside the book, however, covering the open pages, was a sheet of white paper on which was written many dozen times the name George Munzer. Karl stood blushing in embarrassment, still holding his lead pencil. "Wasn't it foolish of me?" he asked. "Not at all. It was a very good exercise for you, and the best thing you could have done. The most important thing for you the first few days will be to make no slip as to your name, and you can't be too familiar with it. Now sit down, and I will give you your instructions." The two men sat in earnest consultation until dinner time, Muller talking and Karl listening carefully, answering only now and then to show that he understood. As they went down to the dining room, Karl's cheeks were flushed, and his eyes shone with pleasurable excitement. The meal passed quietly, and at 1 o'clock they entered the carriage and drove to Greng's agency. The manager of the establishment was already waiting for them in his inner office, as Muller had announced their coming by messenger. Greng studied the young stranger carefully, and could find no fault in his outer appearance, at least. This tall, clean-shaven, good-looking young man, with his slender, graceful figure and his well-cut, simple dark suit, looked more like a young Englishman of leisure than anything else, and Grang was greatly pleased with Muller's protégé. The modest and unassuming but thoroughly well-poised manners of the young man pleased him also. George Münzer said little during the interview, and Muller, who was present, remained strictly impartial. Grang was anxious to have Münzer go see Maximoff at once, but the new young detective refused to do so. It was finally arranged that the introduction to Grang's wealthy client should take place on the following day, at an hour determined by Münzer. Mr. Hartmann spent the rest of the afternoon after his return to Inzersdorf in the society of the Plone family. He strolled over to the house just as the twilight had fallen and found his host in the cozy sitting-room. Maximoff was there also, seated at the piano, accompanying Suzanne's singing. The Russian was an excellent pianist and a particularly skillful accompanist. With delicate understanding of every shading of the mood of the song, his playing melted into the voice, lifting it into clearer prominence, giving it a background of gentle-hued harmonies. He was playing without notes, improvising from time to time, letting his soul speak in the soft flow of harmony his fingers awoke from the ivory keys. His great dark eyes, with their glance of gentle melancholy that hung like a veil of mystery over the velvet-soft depths, were raised in tender affection to the sweet, calm face of the girl who stood beside him. Her eyes answered his as she looked down at him. She, too, had no notes, singing free from memory. She sang for him alone. The quiet little group that sat beyond the radius of light thrown by the tall lamp near the piano had been forgotten by the man and woman whose souls met in the consciousness of one another's nearness, in the harmonies that floated around them like a clinging screen, shutting them in a delicious solitude. Suzanne's slender figure in her pale-colored gown swayed gently as she sang. The lamp gleamed on her fair hair and delicate skin, surrounding her head like an aureole. The simple Scotch ballad that she sang seemed to her an expression of her own happiness as she looked down at this handsome, gifted man, this man with the great heart and the wonderful brain, who had yet chosen her for his beloved, although she was but a simple country girl. The glow of her feeling illumined her rapt face as she sang the simple tale of the prince who plucked a floweret from the hedgerow to wear next to his heart, beating with his heartbeats, happy in his love. But though the floweret was happy but for a brief hour, to wither then and die, happier still was she than if left on her bush to blossom free in wind and sunshine. Better a moment's brief joy than a life of loveless security. The gentle, reproachful sadness of the old ballad melted away in the happiness that shone in Suzanne's eyes and curved her pure lips. When her eyes met those of her beloved, there was no room in her soul for aught but the joy of being his. Muller sat back in the shade, watching the couple at the piano. His busy brain twisted and turned 1,000 possibilities in the crucible of his highly trained intelligence, sharpened to keenness by rich experience. All the while an undercurrent of suppressed emotion welled up from his heart, keeping up a running commentary of doubt to all the suggestions offered by the brain. It can't be true. It simply can't be true, he thought. I'm off on a false trail again, and it's not for the first time either. There'll be some reasonable explanation as to the Napoleon portrait. I know there will. If there is any secret in this man's life, it has something to do with politics, I know. Again he lost himself in the study of Maximoff's features. The Russian's handsome face, with its clear, colorless skin, framed in curly dark hair, wore an expression of calm content. It was a content back of which the warm blood and vitality of the man were beating. There was nothing ox-like in the easy repose of the face. But it was the face of a man who was at peace with himself and the world, for this hour at least. His hands, too, drew Muller's eyes to them, slender white hands, which yet, even in their easy movement over the ivory keys, showed complete muscular control and great strength. They seemed to suit the man's fine figure with the broad shoulders and slender hips, and to complete the picture of virile manhood at its very finest, in the prime of early maturity. The veteran detective, with his deep knowledge of the world and the human heart, wondered that there was not more passion in the grave happiness in Suzanne's eyes. It must be, he thought, that there is no place for sensual passion in her clear soul, or surely this man would be capable of awakening it. A slight movement beside him made him turn, and he saw that Bauer had slipped in and taken the chair to his left. With his mind still full of the charm and strength of the Russian, Muller noticed as never before the utter lack of attraction in this other man. Here, too, were height and evident strength in a human frame, but where in the one case all was grace and easy elasticity, in the other the strength took the shape of an awkward bulk. Maximoff had never been more fascinating, more brilliant than he was this evening. In the radiance which seemed to go out from him, the ugliness of the unfortunate bookkeeper was thrown into greater prominence. Bauer sat hunched together on his chair, evidently not listening to the music, but absorbed in his own thoughts. They were not pleasant thoughts, for his hands twitched nervously. He bit at his lips and swallowed hard every now and then. The detective looked at him more carefully. He knew that this man had been acquainted with Erlach and had been inside the greenhouse more than once. Mrs. Tunner had told Muller that during the 2 years of her service there, Bauer visited her employer about 10 or a dozen times. Like all the others who spoke about the bookkeeper, she was willing to acknowledge that the man seemed to be a faithful worker, a capable businessman, reserved and unobtrusive. But there was always a but when people spoke of Bauer. They seemed to distrust some secret behind his quiet. No one had confidence in him, nor liking for him. The men servants complained of his exacting haughtiness. The women were afraid of him, as he evinced a desire to become aggressive in his attentions whenever he was sure that he would not be found out. The ladies of the Plone family, even the manager's wife, who was anxious always to be just to everyone, made no pretense of liking Bauer. Mrs. Plone was always the cordial hostess to her husband's employees, but Muller saw that it took an effort sometimes for her to overlook Bauer's unpleasant manners. Suzanne was more outspoken and frankly said that it was not so much the man's lack of good looks that bothered her, but the fact that, as she expressed it, there's a certain type of ugliness that comes only from inward vulgarity. Muller remembered all these things now, for he knew that it was worthwhile giving a certain amount of attention to the intuition of cultivated, fine-minded women. He had been watching the bookkeeper lately and had won the man's confidence sufficiently to draw out an invitation to visit him in his room. Here he gained still more the impression of the man's pettiness and meanness, vulgarity, as Suzanne called it. But he realized also that behind this vulgarity there was not enough bigness of heart or soul to make possible the commission of such crimes as had been perpetrated by the unknown with the black cord. By this time Muller had become convinced that Bauer was not this unknown, although he was not quite sure that the bookkeeper might not in some way have been connected with the occurrences in the greenhouse. For there was something on this man's mind, Muller saw that, and a little incident that occurred on this very evening increased his suspicion and reawoke his interest in the bookkeeper. During the singing, Mr. Plone, who had been in one of the other rooms, came to the door and beckoned his wife to him. The couple passed through the next room into the drawing-room, and a subdued sound of voices was heard from there. Muller recognized a strange voice, a man's. They spoke softly, too softly at least to hear at that distance, and through the music, the words that were said. With a curiosity which was one of his unpleasant qualities, Bauer leaned forward as if anxious to see who the stranger was. Suddenly he turned pale, bit his lips nervously, and arose from his chair. He took a step or two towards the door between the rooms, then turned in the direction of the hall door. Here he halted for a moment and came up to Muller. "Mr. Hartmann, would you please make my excuses?" he said hastily. "I have a very bad headache and think I'd better not wait for supper." "Certainly. I'll tell Mr. and Mrs. Plone you're not feeling well," Muller replied, taking the hand the other held out to him. Bauer's hand was cold and moist, and trembled perceptibly. "You certainly do look wretched," continued Muller. "Why, you are trembling all over." I don't feel well. I had better go to my room," murmured Bauer. The man was quite upset, and Muller followed him closely with his eye. The bookkeeper reached the door in a few long strides and closed it gently behind him. Scarcely was the door fully shut before Muller stood beside it. The two at the piano were so absorbed in their music and in one another that they paid no attention to what was going on behind them. And even if they had, there would have been nothing particularly noticeable in the fact that Bauer left the room because he was not feeling well, and that Hartmann should have followed him in case he needed help. But the latter did not leave the room at once. He stood at the door for some few minutes, then turned the knob very softly. He opened the door quickly and looked out into the hall. He saw what he was expecting to see. Ferdinand Bauer stood close to the drawing-room door, listening at the crack. When Muller opened the door of the music room, the sound of the singing came out into the hall so much louder that Bauer started and looked around. Muller closed the door, shutting off the sound, and walked down the hall. Bauer stood waiting for him with an evil gleam in his eye. I was dizzy, he said sharply. Is there anything I can do for you? Can I assist you to your room? Asked Mr. Hartmann with a tone of friendly sympathy. Just think how embarrassing if this door should suddenly open while you were leaning against it. You wouldn't want to tumble into the drawing-room like that. These doors open to the outside, remarked the other in the same sharp tone. Then he turned without another word and walked on towards the covered passageway which led from the main house to the office building. Miss Suzanne is right, thought Muller. It is inner vulgarity that makes this man so unpleasant and has given him this particular type of ugliness. Yes, a man of that kind might easily be led into committing a crime. But this man seems to me to be too petty for the series of crimes that I am following up here. Or, I have been mistaken before in my life. May he not be deeper than I think? They call me infallible, but the world doesn't realize how many mistakes I have made, how many failures I have to my record. They see only my victories. I must be careful here and not go ahead too fast. If this man has not the brain to have planned these crimes, might he not have been the instrument used by another? The only thing here is that there was no robbery committed in the most of these cases, and I do not think that this man would become a criminal without some pecuniary advantage to himself. Or is this only another mistake of mine? Can a soul like his hate enough to murder, or murder for the joy of it? I saw him kick an unoffending dog one day, and yet he is a coward, as was shown by his action just now. Whoever it is inside there frightened him so that he fairly ran away, for the strides he took could almost be called running. Here Muller's thoughts came to a standstill again, and went off in another direction. Again he saw himself in the Erlock house in the dead of night, and saw the tall figure running away with long strides that carried it into the darkness with astonishing rapidity. He must find out what it was, who it was, that had so frightened Bauer just now. He returned to the music room just as Suzanne was gathering up the loose sheets that lay on the piano. Maximoff whirled round on the piano stool and said laughingly, "Our music has driven you all away, hasn't it? You at least have had the courage to come back." Hartmann laughed in answer to the joke, but his mind was on the drawing-room behind him. He walked casually through the music room to where he could see the door. But this did him no good, for the only person within his range of vision now was Plone himself, who stood leaning against a table, smoking. He could catch a glimpse of Mrs. Plone's light dress, but that was all. He had just made up his mind to go into the drawing-room even without being asked, when he heard Suzanne say, "We seem to have a caller." At the same moment there was a sound of chairs being shoved back in the drawing-room, and Mrs. Plone came forward through the intervening apartment. At her side was a cheery-faced, very young lieutenant in the uniform of an infantry regiment. Suzanne gave an exclamation of pleasure and walked forward to meet the stranger. "Why, if it isn't Cousin Fritz!" she exclaimed brightly. "And how nice we look in our new uniform! I suppose you've been up to some mischief and have been sent to Vienna to be punished, eh?" The young man drew himself up for a formal salute as he answered with mock gravity. "Quite right, fair cousin. I've been in Vienna since the 20th of the month, sentenced to attend the coming carnival." "Thinking of pleasure, as usual," continued Suzanne with a merry laugh. "But you haven't met my betrothed yet. Sergius, permit me to present you my cousin, this extremely undignified lieutenant of Imperial Infantry, Fritz von Seelern. Lieutenant von Seelern, Dr. Maximoff." The gentlemen shook hands, and then Mrs. Plone introduced the young officer to Hartmann. The manager asked where Bauer was, and Hartmann gave the latter's excuses for his absence. A few moments later, supper was announced. Mr. Hartmann Muller could not imagine what it was in the appearance of the harmless young warrior that had so upset Bauer. Apparently absorbed in the enjoyment of his supper, the detective listened to the conversation carefully and learned that Fritz von Seelern had not been in Inzersdorf for 3 years. Therefore he could not have met Bauer in this place at least. But might they not have met somewhere else? Some connection there must be between the two men, for Bauer was no fool. He would not have run away for nothing in such excitement. Muller spoke of Bauer 2 or 3 times, mentioning his first name, as it was much more unusual than the surname. But the young lieutenant did not seem to have the faintest interest in this absent Ferdinand Bauer. Muller was puzzled. Suddenly the conversation took a turn that interested him greatly. "What's this I hear about a crime that was committed in this neighborhood recently?" asked the visitor unexpectedly, in the midst of another topic. "I heard some men talking about it in the train. They seemed to think that the police were showing their usual stupidity in not discovering anything yet. Something about an old man, wasn't it? Was it a murder?" Muller volunteered no information, but while the others were talking he watched Maximoff with the greatest interest. Suzanne was the first to speak. "It was old Mr. Urlock who lived alone in the greenhouse," she said. "He was mysteriously missing one morning, and they have not yet found him, either dead or alive." "Urlock? Urlock?" repeated the young lieutenant. "I wonder if that's any relation to my comrade, Paul Urlock. It's his regiment I've changed to. It seems to me I heard that he has relatives hereabouts." "Lieutenant Paul Urlock was the nephew of the missing man," answered Plone, "and is his sole heir if the death is proven." "Is there much money there?" "Yes, quite some, I believe." "Well, I hope Urlock will get it," said Lieutenant Fritz. "He's a nice chap. We all like him. It's hell to be poor in the army, you know." Plone and the ladies continued to give their new guest the details of the affair, and Mr. Hartmann threw in an observation occasionally, stray questions which, although the others did not notice it, were calculated to keep the conversation to this one topic. All the while the detective was watching Maximoff, who sat opposite him. But the man on whom Muller's keen gray eyes were so closely fixed was the most harmless seeming of the entire company. He ate his supper slowly, with the delicate enjoyment of a connoisseur in well-prepared food. He was constantly on the watch for some courtesy to the ladies of the family. He threw in a remark about the excellent wine, and then bent his entire attention towards putting together a new combination of fruits for Suzanne. Everything about the man seemed to point to a perfect calm and a peaceful enjoyment of the moment. There was not a single glance of the eye, not the faintest fleeting shade of expression in his face to show that the subject of the conversation had any interest for him whatever. "Hasn't it occurred to anyone yet that the disappearance of the old gentleman and the other mysterious crimes which have been committed in this neighborhood might all have been carried out by the same person?" remarked Muller, when he thought the interest in the subject was flagging. Mrs. Plone looked up surprised. "Why, no, I hadn't thought of it," she said. Suzanne shook her head. "If it were so, they would have found the black cord in the Urlock house." "Yes, exactly," said her brother. "We spoke of that possibility once before, you remember." Maximoff was occupied in peeling a pear. Under his strong, supple fingers the little knife moved slowly and delicately. "You know you really ought never to peel a pear," he said to Suzanne, "because the very sweetest part of it lies directly under the skin." At this point he stopped and looked right at Hartmann, continuing eagerly. "That's an idea that ought to be followed up. It occurred to me once before, and I forgot to mention it." He returned to Suzanne again. "Who knows whether the great unknown has not left his usual reminder behind him in the greenhouse? Our local authorities have discovered so little in this matter that one carelessness more or less would not be surprising. They may have simply overlooked the uncanny visiting card, as Mr. Hartmann calls it." Maximoff returned to his pear, cut it carefully in pieces, and ate it slowly. He seemed to be pondering over something, and did not take part in the conversation for some few minutes. Fritz was interested in hearing about the other crimes, and they told him the principal details. He, too, was lost in admiration of the reckless courage and the uncanny cleverness of the man with the black cord. When Maximoff had finished eating his pear, he wiped his beard carefully, then remarked, in a pause in the talk, "Your idea has taken complete possession of me, Mr. Hartmann. I think I'll have a chat with our Constable Kern tomorrow, and start him on another investigation of the Urlock house. The detective whose coming was announced to us some time ago seems either not to have come at all, or, like the other brilliant police minds, not to have discovered anything worthy of notice." "Possibly," replied Hartmann, returning the other's smile frankly. Muller had noticed something in Maximoff's speech, the little pause which he put in after the word "seems." To the others it meant nothing, but to Muller it seemed like a sudden change of idea due to caution. Might not a man have said that in just that way, who knew perfectly well that the detective of whom he spoke had been in the greenhouse? And who else could have known of the detective's presence there except the masked man who had taken flight so hastily that night? But this masked man knew also that the guest in the pavilion was the expected detective. The trace of the footprints right up to his garden gate showed Hartmann that he had been recognized. If this man had indeed been Maximoff, who now sat smiling so cordially at Mr. Hartmann, then he must believe that he could play with this Mr. Hartmann as a cat plays with a mouse. His eyes shone brightly, his well-cut mouth curved in cheery lines, as he continued, "I would not be at all surprised if the black cord could be found somewhere in that house. We all know how short-sighted the eye of the law is." Was it mere chance that the man's great dark eyes rested on Hartmann at the moment? Or is he only looking at me so fixedly because it is my thought that he is carrying out at length? Asked Muller of himself. He was conscious of a growing inner excitement, of animation, particularly now that he knew that Maximoff had engaged a detective for some secret work. His talk of a journey to Russia might have been merely a blind to throw Grang off the track, for it was quite possible that this new detective was to be set to spy upon Mr. Hartmann. But all this could only be true if it were also true that Sergius Maximoff was one of the greatest criminals of his day, and this was a thought that Muller could not yet take seriously. All his years of experience had taught the veteran detective that criminals are to be found in every class and in every period of life, had taught him that the most attractive outward appearance may often be a cover for the deepest inner depravity. With his brain, his keen working brain, Joseph Muller believed in no one, trusted no one, but with his heart he was always believing and trusting. He knew that in the mental makeup of every criminal there is some insecure point, some crack, as it were, through which one can at times look into the carefully hidden horrors concealed there. But Maximoff, this highly intelligent, good-hearted man, whose life was so full of work and study and philanthropy, so rich in harmless enjoyment of the beauty of nature, in his love for his art treasures, how could this man bury such horrors in his soul? There are things which are possible, if not probable, but there are other things which are not even possible. While Joseph Muller, the experienced detective, was revolving all these thoughts in his brain, Mr. Robert Hartmann, Polish landowner, was smiling at Dr. Maximoff and repeating his own word, "Possibly." He said it once more, and this time it sounded like a question. Soon after this, Mr. Hartmann rose and made his farewells for the evening. Back in his own room, he took out his notebook and on its last page wrote the one word, collar. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Hartmann is called away. Very early next morning, the guest in the pavilion took a train for the city and drove in a cab to his own house. He was here only a few moments, and one of his errands was to tell Karl to wear a turnover collar when he came to visit Maximoff that morning. Then Muller took the cab again and drove back to the station. As he passed a cigar store, it suddenly occurred to him that he hadn't anything to smoke. He called to the driver, and the cab stopped in front of the shop. When the detective had bought his cigars and come out onto the sidewalk again, his eyes fell on some books in a neighboring window. They were scientific works dealing mainly with modern developments in medicine. Muller paused for a moment, read several of the titles, then returned to his cab, which rolled onward through the streets. Before the station was reached, something peculiar happened. Muller took the burning cigar from his mouth and pulled off his hat. A wave of hot blood flushed his face up to his very hair, and his eyes gleamed brightly. It was but a few seconds, however, before he had regained his usual calm. He gave a short laugh, put on his hat again, and resumed his smoking. Soon his cab stopped at the station, and he walked up and down in front of the entrance, after looking at his watch and ascertaining that there was still 18 minutes before the departure of the train. A few moments later, his own carriage drove up to the sidewalk. Karl Tunner got out, looking very smart in his new clothes. He wore a turnover collar instead of the high-standing collar that he had put on early that morning. Muller and his young companion entered an empty compartment just as the train rolled out of the station. "I nearly forgot the collar," said Muller, looking at the young man with careful scrutiny. "Is it so very important?" asked Karl with a laugh. "Yes, it is very important to change the minor lines of one's appearance, as we cannot change the main contours. With your smooth-shaven face, the turnover collar, a different hat, and different colored clothes, You look so different altogether that Maximoff is not likely to have the faintest suspicion that he has ever seen you before." When the train stopped at an intervening station, Muller changed compartments. He had looked about him on the station in Vienna and was almost certain that no one from Inzersdorf was on the train, still he thought it better that he and Karl should not be seen together. When he returned to the village, he went straight to the factory and spent an hour or so studying the ground plan of the works and investigating the details of the machine installation. No one in the works had any idea that he had made this hasty expedition to the city. If anyone had noticed his absence in the early morning hours at all, it was probably only to think that he had gone for a walk. Most of Muller's time in the factory was spent in Bauer's company. The latter had quite recovered from his upset of the day before, although Muller was still in the dark as to the reason for it. Finally, a little after 12, Hartmann bade goodbye to his instructor, saying that he had to take a train for the city to keep an appointment there at 2 o'clock. He reached his own house in time for dinner and sat there waiting until Karl returned. It was nearly 4 o'clock before the young man arrived. His visit with Maximoff had stretched itself out to such length because the doctor had invited him to lunch. The serious interview concerning the service demanded of him did not take place until after the meal. The Russian had evidently exerted all the spell of his very great fascination, perhaps with a design of binding this young man all the more closely to him. Karl was simply delighted with his new employer. He could not say enough about his wonderful cleverness, his deep learning, and his cordiality. As far as he could make out, the whole thing concerned a quite harmless little service, which, however, might not be without its difficulties. Maximoff had told his visitor that he was politically compromised and did not dare to return to Russia himself. He needed some documents from there which must be in his possession before his approaching marriage. There were personal papers only, a certificate of baptism, marriage certificate of his parents, and various more of similar kinds. Had it not been for his political leanings, he could have sent for these papers through the Russian embassy. But under the circumstances, he did not wish to draw the attention of the official representative of the Russian government to his whereabouts. Therefore, he needed the services of someone else, who must be discreet and quick-witted. He would pay a very large sum for the work, and it might be worth it. Bribes must be given, and complications might arise which would need a clear head and quick wits to meet them. But the principal thing, Maximoff assured the young man, was the matter of discretion. Even these preliminary revelations must remain a deep secret between them. The doctor did not wish the lady who was to become his wife ever to suspect even that he was in danger of arrest in his own country. As he was never likely to return there, he saw no necessity of putting her under the hanging dread of a danger that might never reach him. He would, he said, make the journey together with the young detective until they reached the Russian border. Before he left him there, he would give him the final details, which no one else was ever to know. In a hotel which he would designate in the little town of Austrian, they would meet after the work had been done. Maximoff would take his papers, Munzer receive his salary, and then they would part, never to meet again. This was the main content of the conversation which Karl Tunner had had with the Russian that afternoon. Maximoff evidently had not the faintest suspicion that he was talking to the man who had lived in the Plone house for a week or so as Mr. Hartmann's servant. The arrangements had been easily made, and Karl's engagement for the work was settled before the luncheon was over. Maximoff was pleased with this serious-minded, quiet young man, who had such excellent manners and who spoke so little, who seemed also to attach so little importance to what might prove a dangerous errand. The young man's poise and ease seemed to show that he was brave and quick-witted, and the gleam that lit up his blue eyes when the Russian named the sum he was to receive for the work told the latter that his new employee would surely do his best. The two men parted in mutual satisfaction after arranging how they should meet the following evening at the northern station in Vienna. Muller listened carefully to what Karl told him, asked many questions, and finally announced that he would take part in this expedition himself. Karl was surprised at this, but greatly relieved. In spite of his careless manner, he felt the responsibility of what he was undertaking. Before he left his home, Muller had another little talk with Mrs. Tunner about the Napoleon miniature. She was firm in her assertion that it had been in Erlach's cabinet 2 days before his disappearance, and that no one had entered the house since then. Then Muller repeated his instructions about the telegram which Mrs. Tunner was to send to him to reach him at 6 o'clock on the afternoon of the following day. He did some shopping in the city, and he himself packed both his own and Karl's grips, and ordered them left ready in the hall. The next afternoon, a little after 4 o'clock, the usual group gathered around the tea-table in the Plone sitting-room. Maximoff was there also, and Suzanne sat at his side, apparently in a more tender mood than was her custom. She let her hand rest in his, and gazed up into his eyes more often than usual. When Mr. Hartmann joined the circle, he said to the doctor, "Do you know that I have just come from Rose Cottage? I dropped in there in the hope of seeing you, and asking you to lend me one of your Lombroso books." "Oh, why didn't you take what you wanted? Anything in the house is yours, as you know." "I didn't like to take any without telling you first," answered Hartmann, sitting down and taking his cup. "I'll send over all I have of Lombroso as soon as I get home," said Maximoff cordially. "Oh, no, don't think of it," replied Hartmann hastily. "I don't want to burden your brain with anything more today, for Mrs. Schober and your dear little girl told me that you are going away on a journey this very evening." "Yes, I am going, but—" "May I ask where you are going?" "Just think, he's going to Russia," interrupted Suzanne. "The very thought frightens me." Maximoff laughed and raised her hand affectionately to his lips. "Why should it frighten you, dear? I'm not likely to get in the way of any bomb-throwers. It's only the suddenness of this that has upset you. You see, I did not know until this morning that I would have to go." He turned to Hartmann as he said the last words. "Indeed. It concerns some papers which I need before we can be married. Unexpected difficulties in the getting of them have arisen." "Difficulties that require your own presence, I suppose." "Exactly. And as any hindrance to my wishes always makes me nervous—" "You want to lay them at once? I understand your impatience. I cannot endure the slowness of official red tape myself." "There you see, my dear Suzanne, Mr. Hartmann would do the same in my case." Yes, I understand. I know. But I can't help feeling so strangely uneasy." Suzanne's voice shook as she spoke. Then she smiled with a touch of mockery at her own fears, and continued, "My nerves seem to be playing me tricks lately anyway. There is a presentiment of evil hanging over me. But it's ridiculous, and I will not give way to it. Don't let my foolishness worry you, Sergius. I wouldn't for the world rob you of the good spirits you are in just at present. Get your business attended to as quickly as you can, and come back to us safe and well." The girl endeavored to give brightness to her tone, but underneath the forced cheeriness was a shade of anxiety quite unusual in Suzanne's well-poised nature. Her sister-in-law changed the subject in hope of cheering Suzanne's melancholy, and the men seconded her nobly. Suzanne herself sat quiet, listening with polite attention, but taking no part in the conversation. Shortly after 5 o'clock, Maximoff rose. "You're going already?" asked Suzanne, her eyes dimming. "Yes, I must, dearest," he replied tenderly. "I've had so little time for this thing, and as I do not know how long I will be gone, there is much I must see to in the house. I must get the 6:30 train from here, too, for the express from the northern station in Vienna leaves at 10:05, and the evening service on our slow little road here is not very reliable." "Yes, that's true. Then I see you must hurry," said Suzanne, accompanying him out of the room. When she returned, she sat down beside the others, but seemed still struggling with the unknown dread that was oppressing her usually calm spirits. Muller wondered at it, pondering again over the mystery of the intuition of those who love. The girl's depression awoke an answering melancholy in his own soul, and it took all his strength of will to keep up the conversation. The clock struck 6, and the telegram which he expected had not arrived. Mr. Hartmann continued to chat about all sorts of indifferent things, apparently careless and easy in his mind. 6:30 sounded. Mr. Hartmann was in the midst of an interesting hunting story, and one would not have thought that he had a worry in the world. And indeed Muller was not worried. He knew that his own carriage was waiting for him at the next crossroad, and that his horses, although quite ordinary in appearance, were speedy and reliable, and if necessary he could make the long distance from Inzersdorf to the northern station in Vienna in less than 2 hours. So he had quite some time yet, and could afford to be calm about it. At 6:45 the doorbell rang. "There it is," thought Muller. But when the butler came in, it was only a package of books he brought. Maximoff had sent all the works of Lombroso that he possessed. Hartmann was delighted at this friendliness, and began to talk of the doctor's active interest in psychology. Plone spoke of the Russian as an expert in the field. In the midst of an eager discussion on this interesting topic, the clock struck 7. "I don't need to go really until 7:45, thought Muller. I'll complain of my rheumatism and say that a cup of tea in bed and a good book will cheer me up. While they believe me in the pavilion settling myself for a quiet evening, my carriage will be on its way to the northern station. But I hate to think of the unpleasant surprise these dear people will have tomorrow morning. Just then the doorbell rang again, and the maid brought in a telegram for Mr. Hartmann. He signed the accompanying book, and the girl left the room. Hartmann opened the telegram. "From the Baron," he said. "Goodness! Well, what do you think? There has been a robbery in my house. I must go home at once. My housekeeper sent me word on a postal card. Did you ever hear of such stupidity? Fortunately, all my mail goes to the Baron's office, and he saw that at once and telegraphed me." He let the paper fall from his hand onto the table amid the general condolences of the family. "I won't be able to catch the train that our friend has just taken," he said, looking at his watch. "Must you leave this evening?" asked Mrs. Plone. "Indeed I must, kind hostess. My people appear to have lost their heads entirely, or they would have written more definitely what the trouble is." He took up the telegram again and read it aloud this time, with a tone of anger in his voice. The dispatch read, "Your people send word on postal card of robbery in your house. Ask you to return at once." Wouldn't you think they could have said a few more words? In an establishment like mine, it makes considerable difference what part of the house is entered. Well, I'll have to pack up at once. I think I'll just throw a few things in a bag and leave the rest here, for I want to come again, if you will permit it. I feel that I need a little more time here for my work." His host assured him that he would always be welcome whenever he might come. "Too bad you can't be with Sergius on the train," said Suzanne, but Hartmann replied it would only be a case of going as far as the Prater with him. "I take the Northwestern Railway to reach my home, but I must hurry now, for I have only 40 minutes to pack my bag and take the next train. Many, many thanks for all your kindness to me. I shall miss this pleasant family group, particularly the dear children. But then I hope to see you all soon again. Now let me see when the Baron sent this telegram." Mr. Hartmann was quite indignant now in his excitement. He looked at the paper again. 3:10 p.m., he read. "Well, it took long enough to reach here, didn't it?" "I'll send Wilhelm to help you pack. In the meantime they will be getting the carriage ready," said Plone. "Oh, no, please don't bother about the carriage," replied Hartmann, "but I'll be very glad of Wilhelm's help. He can carry my bag to the station." Another warm handshake, and Mr. Hartmann left the house. He hurried through the garden, and when he reached his pavilion, he opened a window, and leaning far out, he gave a long, sharp, peculiar-toned whistle, which was answered from somewhere in the neighborhood. Then he closed the window and turned on the electric light. When Wilhelm entered 2 minutes later, he found Mr. Hartmann already busy at his packing. "Did you hear that whistling, sir?" asked the man. Mr. Hartmann replied that he had been so absorbed in his packing that he paid no attention to anything else. "There was a whistle, a long, queer whistle, and then it was answered from across the moor. That's no way for decent people to act after nightfall," said the servant, who, as Muller had already noticed, was not particularly valorous. The man was undoubtedly troubled in his mind about his coming back from the station alone. This suited Muller exactly. He closed his bag and locked it, locked the cupboards in which he had left his things, and put the key in his pocket. Then he turned out the light and left the pavilion, Wilhelm carrying his bags for him. "Run up to the house and give the key of the pavilion to Mr. Plone," said Muller. "Then you can follow me to the station." But when they reached the front door, they found Mr. Plone already there, talking to the driver of a carriage which stood in the road outside. "Here's a lucky chance for you, Mr. Hartmann. Here's an empty cab which will save you a few moments in getting to the station. The man has been to Laxenburg, and his horses are tired, but you have time enough, and it will be more convenient than walking. He's been paid for the journey, so he'll take you there for the tip." Mr. Hartmann got into the carriage, and the men parted with another handshake. The wagon rolled off, and Plone returned to the house, followed by Wilhelm, who was heartily glad to be spared the trip to the station. In the cozy, well-lighted sitting-room, Mrs. Plone was reading the telegram which their guest had left on the table. It read just as he had told them. "Your people send word on postal card of robbery in your house. Ask you to return at once. Greeting, Stein." Then she laid the paper down and turned to her sister-in-law. "Did you see how his hand trembled?" she asked. "He seemed quite upset about it." "No wonder," replied Suzanne. "A message like that is apt to upset anybody. I feel so sorry for him. He's such a nice man." "Yes, we shall miss him," said Mrs. Plone. "It was a pleasing change in our quiet life." "Oh dear, it'll be very quiet now that both Mr. Hartmann and Sergius are away. Goodness knows for how long." "They seem to be getting on so well together," said Mrs. Plone, taking up her sewing. "Yes, yes, indeed." Suzanne spoke eagerly. Sergius told me that he had seldom met a man for whom he felt such an instant sympathy and liking as he did for Mr. Hartmann. Mr. Hartmann speaks very well of Sergius, too. Ah, yes, we'll be very lonely without them." One of the men of whom they were speaking rolled through the dreary country towards the little station, his mind quite at ease. As they neared the railway, he bent out of the closed wagon and called to the driver. The carriage stopped, and the man on the box sprang down and came around to the window. "You manage very well, Heberlein. Now you can give me my bags inside here, and then let me see what your watch says." 7:42, replied Heberlein, and Muller continued. 7:38 is the exact time. You must get me to a quiet, badly lighted place in the immediate neighborhood of the northern station at 9:40 at the very latest. You have 2 full hours to make it in. That will be easy. But you'd better be moving now. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14, Part 1 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Muller and Karl go on a journey. At 9:30 that evening, a 2-horse carriage stopped a few steps from a side entrance of the northern station, at the corner of an ill-lighted and little-used street. A quiet-appearing, slender man with heavy spectacles, long gray beard, and gray hair alighted from the carriage. He wore a light brown cape overcoat and a wide-brimmed soft felt hat. After a short conversation with the driver of the carriage, the gentleman took up his bags himself and carried them into the hall where the ticket offices were. Here he left his luggage with a porter and went to buy his ticket. The office had just been opened, and there was a crowd of people, 30 at least, who were pushing their way up to the narrow space in front of the window. The little old gentleman was interested in one person only in this crowd, and that person was Dr. Maximoff. He edged his way up until he stood in the line immediately behind the Russian, and heard the latter ask for 2 first-class tickets to Guernica. While he was getting his change, the old gentleman noticed that immediately behind him in the line was a very impatient lady. Just as Maximoff left the window, the old gentleman stepped back with a deep bow and let the lady go up ahead of him. She acknowledged the courtesy with a smile, bought her ticket, and hurried off. Then the old gentleman's turn came, and he bought a ticket for Guernica first class. He turned and followed Maximoff, who was leisurely mounting the broad steps that led up to the waiting room and the restaurant of the northern station. The old gentleman and his porter walked up equally leisurely. There were but a few people in the roomy, attractive restaurant hall of the first-class waiting room. Muller, who now looked like a man nearing 70, sat down at a table quite near the one at which Maximoff had taken his place and at which George Munzer was already sitting. There was a glass partition between the 2 tables, and Muller sat so that he could not be seen by Maximoff. The 2 men at the other table were talking in French. Easily as he spoke German, Maximoff preferred French, and Karl handled the language very well. This was one of the things which had so pleased the Russian and decided him in favor of the young detective. Their conversation now was quite unimportant, dealing mainly with the supper they had just eaten. Muller smiled at the ease with which his protégé chatted about indifferent things, on the eve of what might prove a hazardous undertaking. He was greatly pleased at his choice of Karl for this work, but he was also pleased with his own disguise, for Karl, as he could see, had been quietly making a scrutiny of all the other men in the restaurant, and his eyes had once or twice rested on the old gentleman who sat beyond the glass wall, but there was no sign of recognition in them. When there were but 14 minutes left before the departure of the night express, Maximoff rose from the table. "They've probably put our luggage in our compartment already," he said, "but you might go and have a look at it. I'll follow you when I have bought some cigarettes. We have a long night before us, and I don't sleep well on the train." The Russian left the room, but Karl sat motionless for a moment or two, his eyes now openly making a tour of the hall. "Why that sigh?" asked Muller, who had risen and come up behind the young man. The latter wheeled around quickly. "Oh, I didn't recognize you. I was afraid something might have prevented you from coming with us," he exclaimed with a sigh of undeniable relief. "Are you in a corridor car?" asked Muller. "Yes, we have a small compartment reserved for us." "You'd better go now. I'll follow you and try to get a seat as near you as I can. At all events, I'll be in the same car." Karl went out in the direction towards the trains, and Muller followed him. picking up the porter with his luggage outside the restaurant. A few minutes later, Muller had secured a seat in the compartment immediately adjoining one on which hung a card, reserved, the compartment into which he had seen Karl disappear. Muller's compartment was also a small one, with room for only 3 people altogether. When the train left the station, he was glad to see that he was still alone. He drew the curtains over the 2 windows that looked out into the corridor, and when the conductor had punched his ticket, he also drew the shade over the lamp on the ceiling. It was a very heavy shade, and the little compartment was now completely dark. The corridor outside was brilliantly lighted. Muller could easily see Maximov's face through the crack where the curtains met on the windows. The doctor was leaning against one of the outer windows in the corridor and smoking. He was talking to Karl, who stood so that Muller could only see his one shoulder. They were not talking loud enough for the listener to understand what they said, but it must have been something pleasant, for Maximov's face was merry, and both men were laughing heartily. A few moments later, Karl's shoulder disappeared from Muller's range of vision. The young man must have gone back into the compartment, for Maximov evidently felt certain that the other was no longer looking at him. How did the old ferret in the dark compartment know this? Something odd that happened just then revealed it to him. Maximov's face had changed suddenly and remarkably. There was a peculiar, set look to it, although his mouth still smiled and his eyes shone. It was a victorious smile, and the brilliancy of his eyes suited it well. Was this merriment called forth by the conversation just closed? Muller had not heard the words, so he did not know. But for that fleeting moment, the brightness and the laughter had taken on something that made them terrible, an ugly gleam as of mocking cruelty. Before the old detective had time to know whether he really saw it, or only thought he saw it, Maximov's face regained its former expression. Karl had returned from the compartment and stood now so that Muller could see his face also. It was smiling and content. The great train thundered on through the night. The 2 men left the corridor and went into their compartment to make themselves comfortable for the hours of rest. Muller followed their example, for he did not intend to stay on watch that night, as he knew it would be quite unnecessary. It was some time, however, before he could lose himself in sleep. For ever and again there arose before his mental vision the picture of the sudden change on Maximov's handsome, smiling face. It was a change so subtle, so quickly come and so quickly gone, that only a trained eye such as Muller's, watching this man with intensity, could have seen it. And yet even he asked himself again and again, did I really see it, or did I mistake? Is it possible that I have at last caught a glimpse, through the weak spot in this man's armor, of the horrors that may lie beneath his charm and fascination? Before Muller finally fell asleep, he started up once more with a jerk. He had been dozing and had lost the consciousness that he was in a moving train. A sudden swaying of the car aroused him. What am I doing here? Why am I on a train? He asked himself. Then the cloud cleared from his senses, and he remembered where he was and why he was there. I don't like this idea of Maximov going with Karl, he murmured, and still less do I like the plan for them to meet in Austrian and finish up their business in this out-of-the-way, obscure little place. There's something decidedly suspicious in that scheme, and that's the reason I'm going along with them. But there's no reason why I shouldn't sleep quietly tonight. There's no danger for the boy thus far, because this mysterious doctor wants his papers, and he hasn't got them yet. So why not sleep as long as I can? Having thus reasoned himself back into a drowsy frame of mind, Muller tried his door again to see that it was locked, put his head down on the cushion, and soon fell fast asleep. He slept so soundly that he did not wake up until the train stopped in Oderberg. He looked at his watch and saw it was 3 o'clock. From then on he did not permit himself to do more than doze, and heard the names of various stations called out, Petrovich, Jejisa, and Oswiecim. When they got to the last station, Muller rose from his couch and looked out into the landscape, still indistinct in the gray morning twilight. Only a few isolated points of light showed where the little town lay. But against the nebulous horizon rose the outlines of the ruined castle which overlooks the town. A great factory which Muller remembered from a former journey shone out at the foot of the hill with its rows of lighted windows. And this is the place where Maximov intends to wait for Karl and pay him off, thought Muller with a look back at the little town as the train rolled on. Why doesn't he pay him in Vienna? I don't understand this thing at all, and I don't like it." On and on through the brightening twilight, through the early gray of a foggy morning, the heavy express thundered, rocking and swaying. Lazy white streaks of mist hung over the many little ponds and lakes, lying with their still waters like uncut jewels between the dark fringe of the forest. Muller dressed slowly, making sure that the curtains of the corridor windows were carefully drawn. It took him some time to complete his toilet, and he spent considerable care in the combing of the long gray beard which had apparently grown during his drive from Inzersdorf to the northern station in Vienna. He smiled to himself as he saw his own slender figure in the glass, for he had left Mr. Hartmann's comfortable curves in his carriage. Long before they reached Guernica, the Russian border station, where the train was timed to arrive at 6 o'clock, Muller had completed his disguise as the quiet elderly gentleman. He was the last to leave the train in Guernica. The inspection of baggage and passes of those travelers who were going on into Russia took quite some time, although it went off smoothly enough. Muller kept at a distance from the two men he was following. He did not need to be near them now, for he knew what the next move was to be. As Karl went past him in the wake of Maximoff, he utilized a moment of crowding pressure on the part of a group of passengers coming through a doorway and thrust a bit of paper into Muller's hand. On the paper was written the word Riga. A meaning glance from the young man's eyes seemed to say that he had heard something of importance which he was anxious to communicate. Karl had indeed heard things which interested him greatly and which he was desirous of talking over with his wise friend and mentor. Shortly after Maximoff and George Munzer had retired into their compartment the evening before, the young man gently reminded his employer that the latter had promised him important details of the work during this first part of the journey. The brightness vanished from the Russian's face at this, and a melancholy gravity took its place. He leaned back in his corner and let his eyes rest in serious, sharp scrutiny on the young man opposite. He did not speak for some time. "Does it not occur to you that I am paying a very high sum for what appears to be a simple service?" he asked finally. Munzer nodded. "You spoke of possible complications," he replied. "I judged that you took these into consideration, and therefore I was not surprised at your generosity." The young man made his reply easily with a careless little smile. Maximoff laid down his cigarette and leaned forward. "You need not be surprised at it," he continued in a low voice, "for I took into consideration that you might have to overcome very great difficulties." "That is what we are here for, to overcome great difficulties," answered the young man, thinking to himself that it was not he who could be depended upon, but the quiet little man in the neighboring compartment. But he continued calmly, "Please, Dr. Maximoff, do not be afraid to tell me everything. I am here to do your bidding." The Russian leaned over, looked at him keenly, and whispered, "Are you ready for anything?" Munzer answered the gaze with steady eyes, and after a moment's pause replied, "Yes, for anything." Maximoff's eyes gleamed. The set look which had given his face the appearance of a mask for a moment vanished. "That is good. That is very good. It is a good thing for you, too," he said with a peculiar smile. His words and his smile struck Karl, and he wondered at them, but he did not let the other see it. "Tell me what it is you want," he said again, and Maximoff's peculiar smile faded. "Listen to me," he began. "My name is not Maximoff. I borrowed this name from a relative who in all probability has been dead many years. I say in all probability, for I do not know for a certainty that the man is dead. Now, there are three possible contingencies for this case of ours. The one that will make it easiest for you is that in the city of this man's home they have had no news from him whatever, and will therefore hand you out the papers without any trouble. The difficulty will arise if he should by any possibility have returned to his home, or if a certificate of death has reached there. Will you know how to manage the matter in either of these cases?" Munzer paused for a moment as if he was thinking it over. Then he gave the answer that he had been ready at once to give. "Everything can be had in Russia for money, and as you are willing to spare no expense—" The doctor nodded as if satisfied. Then he said, the tone of his voice as chill as steel and his eyes shining oddly, "For money, yes, or with cunning, or by force." But before the other could wonder at the words, his voice was gentle again, and he continued calmly, quite the amiable companion as before. "Of course, it goes without saying that you will be provided with sufficient money to buy the documents if necessary." Ah, how true it is that one can never know until life is over into what queer situations one may come. Not so very many years ago I should have been greatly astonished if anyone had told me that it would be necessary for me to steal my cousin's name in order to live a comfortable life undisturbed by the Russian government. Munzer nodded meditatively. Did you borrow his professional title also, or have you a right to it? He asked finally. I am a doctor of medicine in my own right. Sergius and I studied and graduated together at the university in Vienna. Then he went to South Africa and has not been heard of since. I married, became a widower, and settled in Austria. It is 8 years now since I had the last news of Sergius. I don't believe he can have any objection to your use of his name, as he is doubtless dead, remarked Munzer, and Maximoff replied eagerly. Yes, don't you think so? Even the most honest man can find himself driven into deceit at times. When I fled from Russia, hounded by the spies of the government, and hid myself in Austria under the cloak of my cousin's name, I never dreamed that I would marry again, never dreamed that my life's happiness would depend on those papers that I want you to get for me, papers without which the ceremony cannot take place under the laws of my adopted land. With a sigh, he sank back into his cushions again. I can't see anything wrong in what you are doing, declared Munzer calmly. You do not harm anyone by using this name. You can depend upon me. I will do all that lies in my power, in your interest and in my own, to get you the papers. I feel sure that it can be done. You say that I can get along very well in the places where I have to be, with German or French? Yes, it was not necessary for me to find someone who spoke Russian, answered Maximoff. But you want to ask something else. I can see it in your face. What is it that you still want to know? I merely wanted to ask you why you didn't tell me what you've just told me now, when we were together in Inzersdorf. Maximoff made a considerable pause before he answered. I feared that if you knew the truth about the matter you might not undertake the job. Once started on the journey, you would not care to break it off and turn back. Munzer felt that the doctor was not telling the truth now, and it made a disagreeable impression upon him, an impression that was not removed by anything that was said further. For Maximoff declared that he was sleepy and made his preparations for rest, rather hurriedly it seemed, to his companion. He really did fall asleep very soon, into a sleep that was so deep and sound that Karl could have no doubt as to its reality. The young man sat for some time looking at his companion, and it was not the regular deep breathing nor the loosely hanging arms that told him that the man on the other seat was really asleep. It was the expression of his face. Maximoff was dreaming. His soul, untrammeled, went on its own free way through the ether. Through what paths did it wander? Karl drew back into his corner, and young and strong as he was, he shivered as if with a severe chill. The Russian had smiled in his sleep, but the smile that drew his lips apart and distorted the usually agreeable lines of his face was the smile of a fiend incarnate. Do I only think so? Thought Karl, shuddering. Is it the wavering light on his face and my own imagination that makes me think so? He could not come to a decision about it, for Maximoff turned over suddenly, and his face was hidden from his companion. It was long before Karl could fall asleep. He did not know the reason of Muller's interest in the Russian doctor. His patron had told him no more than that they must keep an eye on Maximoff, and before they parted he had reminded him to watch every movement, every expression of the other, and to remember every word of the conversation. The veteran detective had not given his young protégé the faintest hint of his belief, of his suspicion rather, that Maximoff was the man who had fled before him that night in the greenhouse, and who had followed them in their wanderings over the moor back to the gate in front of the pavilion. And yet Karl in his heart had an inkling of Muller's suspicion, and of the fact that this suspicion was the reason for their present journey. But he too asked himself why this mysterious and terrible man with the black cord, who now knew for some time that the supposed Hartmann was a detective who was on his trail, could have left them so undisturbed, and he too found no answer to the question. The young man sat for hours watching the sleeping Russian. Again and again a shudder ran through his frame when he recalled the mysterious words the other had said, accompanied by a smile that was equally mysterious. The words, "That is good, that is very good, that is very good for you also." And more did the certainty come to him that he himself would have been in great danger after hearing the other's secret, if he had not declared himself ready for whatever might happen. It was some time after midnight before the young man fell into an uneasy slumber. When the train rolled out of the station at Chebinya, he sprang up again and saw Maximoff standing in front of him, smiling cheerily down at him. "Had a good sleep?" asked the doctor, who was already fully dressed and just about to take a roll of banknotes out of his pocketbook. In spite of the varied experiences of his life, Karl was still too new at his present work not to be surprised at his own changing sensations. At the present moment, he could not understand how, in the stillness of the night on the sleeping train, he could for one moment have imagined that Maximoff and that terrible unknown were one and the same person. How was it possible that these great melancholy eyes, this sympathetic face, so serious and yet so cordial, should belong to such an unscrupulous criminal? It was quite impossible. With a feeling of remorse, the young man pressed the hand the other held out to him. "We will soon part," said the doctor with a sigh, "and when we meet again I hope you will bring to me the papers that I need so greatly, the papers upon which the happiness of my life will depend. You are young yet, Munzer. Your heart beats warm with sympathy, as the heart of youth should beat. I hope that you really understand what your success in this matter means to a man who has gone further along life's weary pathway than you have, and I hope that you will have the courage, if need be, to force fate and put through your will, no matter what difficulties may occur." He pressed the young man's hand firmly as he spoke and looked at him with a glance of ardent pleading. Then, straightening himself up, he continued in a calm and businesslike tone. "Here are 4,000 rubles in notes, and in this little bag you will find a large sum in gold and silver, Russian currency. I know the conditions into which I am sending you, and I know that the money I am giving you will be sufficient. I am relying on your intelligence and your discretion, and I hope to meet you in less than a week in Oswiecim. I will not appear to know you in the station in Granica. It is better that we should not be seen together there at all. I will wait on the street outside the railway station, and you can wave to me from the train. This will show me that you have passed the frontier without trouble. In Riga you must buy yourself another ticket to Wenden, your last destination. And now, good luck to you." Another warm clasp of the hand, then the doctor took his grip and went out into the corridor. 2 or 3 minutes later the train halted in the frontier station of Granica. When the luggage and the passports had been examined, the passengers who were crossing the border into Russia were allowed to enter the waiting train. Muller and Karl were together in a compartment. The latter stood at the window watching Maximoff, who, plainly visible, was strolling up and down the street. When the train began to move, Karl waved his handkerchief, and Maximoff took off his hat and whirled it around his head 2 or 3 times. End of Chapter 14, Part 1. Chapter 14, Part 2 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Muller and Karl go on a journey. Continued. "Well, what's your report?" asked Muller, as Karl sat down opposite him. The young man gave him a detailed account, reciting word for word what had happened since he and the doctor set forth on their trip the evening before, and everything that had been said between them. He showed Muller the papers and the money which had been given him. The veteran detective took charge of both. There was only one document of importance, an official paper stating that the physician and house owner, Sergius Maximoff, had been a member of the community of Inzersdorf for 6 years. Muller was not surprised at the important points in Karl's report. He knew already that there was something wrong in the doctor's past, and now he felt certain that it was not a political matter. There must be some other reason why Maximoff did not dare return to his own country. The remark, "That is very good for you also," that Maximoff had made to Karl seemed to corroborate Muller's suspicions. What would have happened if Karl, once started on this mysterious journey, had not been willing to agree to any schemes the other should unfold? In all likelihood, he would never have returned to Austria, would have disappeared somewhere en route. Was it not possible that Maximoff intended to let him disappear when he handed him the papers in Oswiecim? Was it for this reason that an obscure little town near the Polish frontier had been chosen for a meeting that might just as well take place anywhere else along the route, or better than all, in Vienna? A great many things can happen in these obscure little Polish towns. A stranger, particularly when registered under a false name in a hotel, can disappear and never be heard of again. Muller thought of all this and remembered the peculiar fleeting change in Maximov's face the evening before when the Russian was alone in the corridor. The travelers took a short rest in Warsaw. When they entered the train to continue their journey to Riga, Muller had already laid aside his false beard and wig. They spent the night in Riga, and the next day about noon they arrived in the little county seat of Wenden. They took rooms in the best hotel in the place, freshened themselves up a bit, ate dinner, and then walked over to the principal square of the town to make inquiries in the main post office for the address of Dr. Sergius Maximov. But there was no Dr. Maximov in this little town of about 5,000 inhabitants. The friendly official behind the window, an elderly man who had served at his present post for many years, told them he was quite certain that in all the city of Wenden there was only one Maximov, and this was not Sergius Maximov, but Andreas. Also, he was not a doctor, but an elderly retired government official who lived with his wife on the edge of the town near the great park belonging to the palace of Count Sievers. But the postmaster remembered now that some years ago letters were sent to Pretoria in Africa. Yes, it was Pretoria, letters addressed to a Dr. Maximov. He supposed this to be the son of Andreas Maximov. Letters had come from this faraway son, and he had noticed them because of the postage stamp. But it was some years since any of these letters had come, and in fact, as far as the official knew, the correspondence had stopped altogether. This was all he could say about the matter, and it was all that Muller wanted to know. The worst contingency, the possibility that the real Sergius Maximov was alive and in his home, had not occurred. The only danger now was that there might be a certificate of his death in existence in Wenden. This possibility did not worry Muller much. He knew that he would be able to cope with it, as he had funds at his disposal and his own quick wits to rely upon. It was his intention really to obtain the papers for Maximov, even if they would never be used in the way the Russian wanted to use them. They would be ready for Karl to hand to him in Oswiecim as arranged. Muller was very anxious to know what would happen then, and he did not intend to lose the opportunity of finding out. Possibly nothing would happen at all. It may have been a mere chance that this obscure little town was chosen as the meeting place. Maximov had to stay away from his home for a certain length of time anyway, as those he left behind supposed him in Russia. He would have to meet his representative somewhere along the line of the journey, so why not Oswiecim as well as any place? Whether this was the case, or whether Muller's darker suspicions were justified, well, he would be on hand if necessary to protect the young man whom he had sent forth on this mysterious errand. "And now," said Muller to his pupil as they left the post office, "what would be your next move?" "Why, I think that even if the government offices are open at this hour and the papers could be obtained, it would be better not to go there first, but rather to make the journey to the outskirts of the city, to the park of Count Sievers," answered Karl. "Quite right. And then I would have a chat with Mr. Andreas Maximov if I could find the gentleman at home." "Quite right," repeated Muller. "That would be the best thing to do. But now, as I am taking for granted that you will have more interest in looking about you in a strange town than I have, suppose you play the part of a distinguished tourist today and take a stroll through this place with your Baedeker very much in evidence. I will meet you in our hotel at 7 o'clock. There's no need for more than one of us to call upon Mr. Andreas Maximov." Muller handed Karl the red-covered book, raised his hat, and walked on down the street. It was not a long walk to the outskirts of the little town. One or two inquiries along the way, and Muller soon found the park and the home of the elder Maximov at its gate. It was a pretty little house, set in a pretty little garden. Its walls were gray with age, and its overhanging roof, darkened by wind and weather of decades, made it look like some old bird spreading out its wings and crouching close to the ground to escape the cold. A couple of fine old pine trees towered above it, and although it was still October, the frost lay thick on the ground in this northern land, and the attractive scenery wore its winter dress. Muller rang the bell, and when the door was opened by a simple-looking peasant woman, he asked if he might see Mr. Maximov. The card he handed the girl bore the name of George Munzer. The master of the house, a comfortable-looking elderly gentleman wrapped in a voluminous woolen dressing-gown, came to meet him cordially. Muller announced himself as an Austrian who had been a college-mate of the old gentleman's son in Vienna 12 years before. He had found himself in Wenden on business and stopped in to see Sergius in case the latter might be at home. The old man shook his head sadly. He could not tell his visitor, he said mournfully, whether his son was still alive even. Sergius had been lost to him for many years. No news had come of his fate anywhere. The last he knew was that his boy had gone to South Africa to the Boer colony, and then he had heard no more. Muller's sympathy with the kind old man's sorrow was quite genuine, and was so soothing to his host that the latter was evidently anxious his visitor should remain for a more lengthy chat. Interesting strangers from elsewhere, particularly those who had known his son, were a rarity in old Maximov's quiet existence. Fortunately for Muller, however, the garrulity of old age, and of those who live in the country, was stronger than the natural interest to hear tales of the college life of his lost son. The old man wanted to talk, not to listen. So it was easy for Muller to get him started on family affairs, on a discussion of his few other relatives. Among these was a nephew by the name of Nikolai Simarenko, of whom the old man seemed to have a good deal to tell. What he did say about this nephew was so interesting that Muller kept the conversation confined to this topic for the rest of his visit, for the better part of an hour, in fact. Twilight had fallen as Muller returned to the center of town. He walked through the quiet streets, wrapped in the hush of the early northern night, his own thoughts spreading a cloud about him heavier than the leaden pall on the sky above. When he met Karl and they had retired to their own rooms after supper, he told the story of his afternoon. The recital of what he had learned so excited the young man that he tossed restlessly for the greater part of the night. Before noon the following day, Karl handed Muller the 3 documents that were the official reason for their journey. There was no difficulty in getting them, and it was only to hasten the deliberation of governmental procedure that Karl was obliged to expend some of the money Maximov had given him for the purpose. The 2 men left Wenden that same afternoon, taking the express to St. Petersburg. But Karl arrived alone in the imperial city. His patron had given him 2 days' leave to look about him in this famous town, the second city of importance in the Russian Empire. Muller himself left the train at Dorpat, after arranging that Karl should meet him there on the 3rd day following. Left alone, Muller went to his hotel and retired early. Next morning a 2-horse carriage which he had ordered was waiting for him as soon as the tardy northern day had broken. Far out into the country he drove, all through the short hours of daylight, past many little villages and wayside lakes, with quiet black waters, over rough wooden bridges crossing streams already quieting down for their winter sleep, through miles and miles of dreary moorland and gloomy pine forests. Finally, as the sun was already setting in the west, the horses stopped their tireless trot in front of a modest little wayside inn, where Muller spent the night. Next morning the journey began again. This time, however, the drive lasted only 2 hours. Then a halt was made at another wayside inn, where the horses were unharnessed and led to the stable to rest, and Muller went on foot. His destination was a large building, almost a castle in size and appearance, which lay in the midst of a beautiful, wide-stretching park. But in spite of its impressiveness, there was a gloom about the handsome structure. High brick walls and heavy iron gates surrounded the carefully kept park, and on all the windows of the great house massive iron bars were firmly set in the stone walls. Muller remained here for a long time. Then he returned to the inn, took dinner there, and drove back to his quarters of the night before. He slept uneasily, waking from time to time, and murmuring incoherent sentences. The old detective chided himself for his distress of mind, for he knew that he should have been greatly satisfied with what he had discovered. He knew that he was about to add another achievement to his record, one which perhaps would be counted among his finest. Then the following day the long drive began again, all through the hours of daylight until Dorpat was reached. By this time the conflict in his heart had calmed down, and he knew that he would do as he had always done, resign himself to the inevitable and accept the success which he purchased with such a wrench to his nerves and to his soft heart. He slept quite well that night, and next morning Karl arrived punctually at the prearranged hour. The young man was fairly bubbling over with the enjoyment of his 2 days' sightseeing in the beautiful Russian capital. Muller let him have his say about it first, because he knew that what he had to tell would darken his young friend's mind as it had his own. And indeed it did. Muller told his story as they sat alone in the compartment on their way to Riga. and Karl sat quiet, subdued, and depressed by the terrible narrative. When they reached Riga, they dispatched a telegram at once. The message read, "Will arrive tomorrow morning, 8:39. Should recommend immediate continuing of journey. G.M." The telegram was addressed to Adam Kaczynski, Station Hotel, Oswiecim, Galicia. Then the travelers sought a comfortable hotel and did not resume their journey until the following day. They stopped in Warsaw long enough for Muller to disguise himself as a heavily bearded elderly gentleman. This time, however, his cape overcoat was not light brown, but dark gray. It was buttoned its full length, so that a willful breeze could not reveal the fact that its lining was light brown. The majority of Muller's outer garments were arranged in this way to play a double part. The hair, beard, and hat he wore now had all quite another color than those in evidence on the hitherward journey. His eyes were covered with smoked glasses, and it would have been quite impossible to recognize him as the white-haired tourist on the Viennese Express 2 or 3 days back. When they were on the last stretch of their journey, Muller rose from his seat, gathered up his luggage, and said, "Now, my dear Tunner, I shall have to leave you to yourself. It is a difficult game you will have to play, a game in which your very life may be at stake. You must carefully calculate every word you say, every expression of your face, and be ready for even the most cleverly put questions. If this man gets the faintest suspicion that you know about his past, then your life is in the greatest possible danger, even if you do not leave the train in Oswiecim. I will be in the next compartment, but even then, if he knew the truth, I might not be able to reach you soon enough to save you." He pressed Karl's hand warmly and went into the next compartment, which already bore a placard, "Reserved," on its door. As the train drew in, Maximoff stood on the platform, his luggage carried by a porter behind him, ready for the journey. George Munzer waved his hat from the door of the train. "Everything all right?" cried Maximoff as he saw him. "Everything all right," answered the young man. "Come aboard. I have a reserved compartment." Maximoff jumped on the train, paid off his porter, arranged his luggage, and then shook his employee's hand warmly. "Your wish is fulfilled," said Munzer. "Settle yourself comfortably, and I'll tell you my story and give you the papers." "Did you have any trouble?" Maximoff was so eager to ask this question that he did not even wait to take off his overcoat. Munzer helped him make himself comfortable in the corner of the seat, and then handed him the documents and the rest of the money. He reported that there had been no trouble about 2 of the papers, but that the usual bureaucratic deliberation had made it necessary for him to wait 3 days in Wenden before he could come into possession of them. He had utilized his spare time in a careful inquiry as to whether Sergius Maximoff had returned home, or whether it was known that he were married or dead elsewhere. When the 3 days had passed, he got the papers. But there had been a lot of red tape and bother about it, particularly about the fact that Maximoff had not come himself, or taken the usual political routine through the consulate. "In short, I had to dip into your purse a bit and relieve it of some of its contents," the young man concluded. "But you were ready for that contingency, and the main thing is that you have your papers." "And a great burden is lifted from my mind," said the doctor cheerfully. "I cannot tell you how happy it makes me. Thanks, hearty thanks, that you carried out the affair so cleverly. Here is the money you were to receive for your services. But now tell me, why did you want to continue the journey at once? Why didn't you want to stop overnight in Oswiecim?" "Why, I suddenly remembered that if I went right on, it would give me time to stop off at Prerau and visit dear friends of mine whom I haven't seen for some time. Business calls me back to Vienna, but if I saved 24 hours now, I would still have a little time with them." "That was a good idea," observed the doctor. "Then we will part in Prerau. Forever, probably." "That will be entirely as you wish it, sir," replied Munzer modestly. Then they lit their cigars and chatted for a while about indifferent subjects. But Karl noticed that Maximoff seemed uneasy about something. Knowing what he did, it was not difficult for him to guess what was troubling the other. He was anxious to get the dangerous moment over with, so he began himself to speak of the subject that might lead to the question he was waiting for. He began to talk of Wenden, what a quaint little town it was, and how there wasn't much to see there, but that the country was pretty, and that the days spent there had not been unenjoyable. Then he paused, puffed lazily at his cigar, and waited. The doctor made some remarks about Wenden, then continued casually. "Oh, by the way, didn't you say that as you were making inquiries about Sergius, you learned that his parents still lived in the city?" "Yes, that's what they told me in Wenden." "Well, then, it seems to me that a simpler method of getting the information you wanted would have been to visit the old people and ask about their son." "Surely," replied Munzer. "That was my intention. But Andreas Maximoff was on a trip to St. Petersburg, was not expected back for a week or two, and his wife was ill in bed. Under the circumstances, I thought it better not to disturb the old lady, particularly as I gathered all the information necessary from other sources. Yes, that's true. It was quite unnecessary. You are right. The relief he could not control gave a brightness of tone to Maximoff's voice and cleared the shadow from his face, the look of anxious cunning from his eyes. Karl, on the watch for every little sign, recognized this and felt a corresponding ease at his own heart. He was not lacking in courage, but he knew that if he failed to recognize the proper moment, or to give the right answer to this question, even the few years of youth in which he had the advantage of Maximoff might have availed him little against the other's remarkable quickness of brain and physical strength, and against his almost devilish ingenuity in mischief. The parting in Prerau was most cordial. Maximoff remained at the window of his compartment, waving his hand to the young man, who himself stood on the platform until the train was out of sight. Left alone, Maximoff took out the documents again and read them through. A tender smile illumined his eyes and curved his lips. As he put the papers back into his pocket, he murmured gently, "Suzanne, my darling Suzanne." His heart was light and free. 1,000 rosy visions flashed through his brain. Life was opening out before him at its fairest. And yet only a thin partition lay between him and his fate, for in the next compartment sat Joseph Muller. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. On the eve of action. One beautiful moonlit October evening, brilliant with the clear atmosphere of late autumn, a jolly company sat together at the supper table in the Plone House. The guests who had been together at that hospitable board so often were all there again. Bauer and Gebhardt, Maximoff and Hartmann. The doctor had returned 2 days before, but Hartmann did not reach Inzersdorf until that very afternoon. During the early part of the meal, Maximoff gave a witty account of how he had discovered on his journey to his home country that he had grown completely out of touch with the habits and customs there, that even the food did not taste the same to him. As he intended to spend the rest of his life in Austria, he was glad to recognize that he had become such a thoroughly good Austrian. He also told them that he was sending Mrs. Schober and Sonia to Vienna the following day to have the little girl fitted for a coat made from some valuable sealskins he had brought with him. The latter half of the supper was devoted to a report by Hartmann of the robbery in his house and the damage done there. The Polish landowner had recovered from the depressing effect of his loss and was ready to look at the matter from the humorous side, more especially as he had recovered most of the really valuable property that had been taken. "And since they found the robber," began Gebhardt slowly, and Bauer, who seemed greatly interested, interrupted and finished the sentence himself. "Then there's nothing more to be done in the matter." "No," replied Mr. Hartmann, "there's nothing more to be done in the matter. It's all quite clear now. Absolutely clear." He said the words very slowly and very thoughtfully. There was a sad gravity in his eyes, for which the amusing account he had just given did not supply the motive in any way. These sad, dark eyes rested quietly on the charming group of Suzanne and Maximoff. The man was bending gracefully forward as the girl turned the soft oval of her cheek up to him, and he fastened an earring into the delicately tinted lobe of her ear. They were a pair of unusually shaped ornaments which Maximoff had brought his betrothed as a reminder of his Russian journey. One of the earrings would not stay closed, which was the reason of the doctor's present occupation with it. Muller's eyes, dimmed and darkened by the thoughts within as he looked at the attractive couple, suddenly grew sharp and keen and focused immediately on the ornament in Suzanne's ear. He realized first that he had seen these earrings in Maximoff's cabinet of curiosities, and wondered that Suzanne had not seen them too. They were a rather peculiar setting, the French fleur-de-lis in diamonds hanging from a single jewel of considerable size, which was inserted in the ear. He knew, of course, that Maximoff had not been to Russia, but that he was obliged to make those around him believe that he had taken the journey. This first little deception about the earrings was clear to Muller, but under it was a dim memory of something else connected with the jewel. Suddenly he knew what it was, and the quick vibration of every nerve through Muller's frame translated itself into such a violent movement of Mr. Hartmann's left hand that he had almost upset his wineglass. Fortunately, only almost, otherwise the claret in the glass would have made an ugly stain on the snowy cloth. The hand lay quiet on the table now, and the fingers, which had been drawn together as if in a cramp, slowly straightened themselves out again. "You are not well?" asked Mrs. Plone gently and sympathetically, so that he alone could hear. "Or have you lost more than you are willing to tell us?" Mr. Hartmann bowed his thanks to the gentle hostess and replied, "No, that is not it, kind friend. But it was a sudden shock, a painful surprise, that upset me for a moment." "Why, how strange," said the lady. "A painful surprise? Here? Now?" Mr. Hartmann drew her hand gallantly to his lips. "Don't let us speak of it," he pleaded. "Some little incident, unimportant in itself, will often bring up a painful memory. I need not assure you that whatever I said a moment back had nothing whatever to do with—" Hartmann stopped as if seeking for words to finish his sentence, and turned his attention rather too markedly to the dish of fruit handed him at this moment by the maid. "Oh, how beautiful!" he exclaimed. "What a charming arrangement of form and color!" It took him some time to sufficiently admire the attractive dish and to choose what he wanted himself. This enabled him to forget to finish his sentence. "Then you, too, are nervous sometimes?" said Plone, who sat at his other side. "Even you cannot always control your feelings. I thought you one of the most perfectly poised natures I have ever met." "I'm afraid you overestimate me," returned Hartmann, smiling. "Although, of course, you could not know the struggles I have had to learn outer composure, at least." "Only outer composure? Then you are upset sometimes, even if you have learned how to conceal it? Then your soul can lose its poise?" It was Maximoff who spoke now. He looked into Hartmann's eyes with kindly interest as he continued. "It is as psychiater that I ask, and also as such that I would really like to know what excited you a moment back. For I know it could not have been a petty or unimportant matter." "No, it was not a petty nor an unimportant matter," replied Hartmann, and his eyes, again deepened by melancholy gravity, rested sadly on the doctor's handsome face. "The thing that suddenly came to my mind that so upset me concerns the downfall of a human destiny. You are a psychiater. I can well believe that you would find my mental trouble of a few moments back interesting as a study. If you wish, we can talk it over tomorrow. Will it be convenient to you if I come at 11 o'clock? I have important business to attend to later." "Oh, please come, surely," said Maximoff. "I am glad to see you at any hour." "Then he is to know the secret?" pouted Suzanne. "But we aren't worthy of it? I don't think that's nice of you." "You'll hear it later, Miss Plone," replied Hartmann, "but not now. It's too long and sad a story to tell at such a time." The girl's eyes met his as he spoke. Suddenly the smile on her lips faded, and her eyes widened while she gazed as if hypnotized into the intelligent, keen gray eyes of the man who had spoken. A shudder ran down her spine. All unconsciously something in her heart asked the question which his eyes feared to answer, and he turned away. Suzanne shivered, then laughed a forced laugh and made some indifferent remark. No one had noticed the little scene, but Muller was startled to his very heart by it. It was as if his thoughts had taken visible form and shape in his eyes, and this sensitive woman's soul had seen the picture, the doom that would so terribly change her own life. Mrs. Plone rose from the table, and her guests followed her example. Still under the impression made by the conversation of a moment or two before, the company bowed to one another silently, as if not in the mood for the usual spoken greetings which are a pleasant habit of the close of a meal in all Teutonic countries. One person alone, Bauer, not quite fine feeling enough to recognize the mood of the others, broke the little pause with a loud, harsh "Probst Mahlzeit." Then something happened which gave a second and more severe surprise to the little gathering. Mr. Hartmann lost control of his nerves again, and this time Bauer's remark was the cause of it. The bookkeeper was in the habit of joining in the usual Austrian expression used on such occasions, but once in a very great while, and this happened to be one of the times, he would affect the travelled man and use the North German Probst Mahlzeit. Hartmann wheeled around as he heard it, stared right in Bauer's face, and then gave a loud, short laugh. It was a laugh full of scorn, and the glance of Hartmann's eyes, which seemed to run the bookkeeper through and through, was equally scornful. The two ladies were startled out of their usual composure by this astonishing impoliteness on the part of their polished and considerate guest. Gebhardt shook his head, and Plone and Maximoff exchanged surprised glances. Bauer flushed and moved a step forward towards the man whose laugh had sounded like a deliberate insult. "What do you mean?" he said in a tone that was like a hiss of anger. Then Hartmann laughed again, but this time quite naturally and cheerily as he replied, "One who knows had to laugh at your propre mausite." The others exchanged glances again. They would have begun to doubt Hartmann's sanity had not Bauer's changing expression proved that he at least understood the sense of these incomprehensible words. The bookkeeper's angry surprise had given way to a start of embarrassment. His face was deadly pale, his lips drawn back, and he looked as he wished the ground would open and swallow him up. "Well, you needn't lose your head about it completely," said Hartmann with a somewhat forced gaiety. "We can talk over the matter in all calmness tomorrow morning. You'll honor me with a visit to my charming retreat, will you not?" Then turning to the others, he continued easily, "Dear friends, you will forgive me if I leave you now? My nerves seem to be quite out of my control tonight, and I think it will be better for me to retire and get a good sleep. I will be no loss to you, the way I am feeling now." He bowed again and left the room. A few moments later he locked himself in his pavilion, and without turning up the light, walked to the window and stood looking out on the moonlit moor beyond. "I'm glad to hear that Sonia and Mrs. Schober will be in the city tomorrow," he murmured. "I believe I have a fever tonight. My pulse is beating at an unnatural rate. It's the same old story. No matter how old I grow, I cannot control my excitement at this stage of the game. And this case. But I want to hear from his own lips the truth about his own condition, and therefore I must be calmer and more clear-headed than ever tomorrow. It is not only that my success will be in doubt, but my very life will be in danger if I do not play my part well. About noon tomorrow, my life will be hanging on a thread. There isn't an insurance company in the world that would take the risk if they knew the particulars. But even at this price, there is nothing in the whole world that would compensate me for the loss of that hour that is to come. It will be the most interesting experience of my life. And he lets her wear those earrings. When I suddenly realized where they came from, it upset me completely. I must be growing old to lose my grip on myself like that. And then this propre mausite. Such a ridiculous, such a silly affair as that other is, but it was just the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't know what those dear people will think of me. Well, we'll get through somehow till tomorrow, and tomorrow the bomb will burst. Tomorrow. And those enormous footprints that I saw down there by the gate? They have added another sensation to this case. Every day I ask myself why he does not kill Mr. Hartmann, for he must have recognized the latter as his enemy. That is the biggest riddle of all. I hope that tomorrow I will find the solution for it also. Provided I am alive tomorrow, that is, for it's not at all certain. My conduct was foolish tonight under the circumstances. Why, I directly challenged the man to end it all himself. It would be easy enough to put a bomb under this little house here. Still, the man's recklessness and audacity are so great that it probably affords him the keenest pleasure to play with me as a cat plays with a mouse. No, on second thoughts, I doubt if my sleep will be disturbed tonight. All these thoughts passed through the old detective's mind as his eyes wandered over the dreary sweep of the black moor to which the moonlight gave a veiled charm it did not possess by day. Muller's pulses beat hastily, the blood throbbed at his temples, but his inmost soul was calm, and the brain behind the quiet gray eyes was keen as steel. Suddenly he started back from the window, for he had just heard the sound of a footfall outside. Someone was walking about the pavilion inside the wall. Muller listened for a moment, then crept out of the room and opened the front door softly. He slipped down the steps unseen and hid himself behind the bush that stood at the foot of the stairs. But he had scarcely found his position before he left it again and came out into the moonlight, saying with a light laugh, "Oh, it's you, is it? Then you couldn't wait till tomorrow? You absolutely had to know today how I found out your secret?" The man who stood before him was Bauer, the moonlight lying full on his pale, ugly face, which was less repulsive than usual because it bore so clearly an expression of fear and shame. The soft heart of the old detective awoke again. Poor soul, what a petty coward it is, anyway, he thought to himself. Then he said aloud with a calm, severe voice, "But you are quite mistaken if you think that I intend to answer any questions of yours. It will be quite the other way around." I am ready for anything you wish," stammered Bauer. "I will answer any questions, and give any satisfaction that may be demanded of me." Muller smiled scornfully. "All that is demanded of you is that you make a humble apology, a written apology, stating that you were the sender of the 2 stupid and malicious anonymous letters received by Lieutenant Erlock. If you do this, I'll promise you that the affair is closed forever." I'll do it," stammered the poor coward again, and Muller answered, "Very well, then. And now you can go home and go to sleep." He turned towards his own door again, but Bauer threw out a hand to stop him. "Well, what more do you want?" grumbled the detective. Will Cornelia read my letter?" gasped the bookkeeper, his face flushed. "Miss von Feldern, you mean?" corrected Muller. "Miss von Feldern," repeated Bauer obediently, "who now, I hope, will never be annoyed again by your poems and flowers." "Never again," declared Bauer, hanging his head. He looked so entirely repentant and miserable that Muller's anger was lost in pity. "You know Lieutenant Erlock personally, do you not?" asked the detective. Bauer nodded, and Muller continued. "And you didn't realize that you could have no possible chance to supplant him in the affections of the lady?" "Miss von Feldern did not know from whom the letters and flowers came." "But you knew her personally?" "Yes, I met her in my mother's house." "Did she ever notice you particularly?" The amorous bookkeeper sighed deeply as only answer. "There, you see," said the other more good-naturedly, "when a man knows that the lady has no interest in him whatever, then if he is a man he will not annoy her with his attentions and only make himself ridiculous by doing so. And above all, it is an unmanly thing to play an ugly trick on the more fortunate one who has honestly and fairly won the lady's heart. There, that's all I have to say. Is there anything more that occurs to you?" "Why, Mr. Hartmann, I would like to know how you—" "Oh, how I recognized you as the writer of those wretched letters? Well, I'll allow you to suppose that I know Lieutenant Erlock, that he showed me the letters, that I suggested jealousy as a motive for writing them. Furthermore, that Miss von Feldern was questioned and told us that some unknown admirer sent her poems and flowers while she was living in the country, also that her landlady there had a son who appears to have been something like you. Furthermore, you may also suppose that Mr. Plone happened one day to mention that you are a poet in secret, and that you send flowers to a lady whose name he does not know. I scarcely noticed what he told me about you, for my head was full of a more important matter. Besides which, your name is Bauer, and the mother of the man Miss van Feldern mentioned is a Mrs. von Probst." "Was," interrupted the bookkeeper. "My mother has been dead for nearly 2 years now. Mr. von Probst was her second husband." "Oh, indeed." Now it was Muller's turn to blush hotly as he realized that he had been caught in a bit of carelessness. He should have known long ago that Bauer was the writer of those 2 letters. A few simple questions or one look at the police records would have told him what he wanted to know. Of course, from the very beginning he had treated the matter of the letters as of little importance, and it had had nothing whatever to do with his coming to Inzersdorf. But it was a mistake on his part to forget any detail that might in any way be connected with the principal matter in hand. Muller was very much dissatisfied with himself, and whenever this happened he was always extremely considerate of others. He laid his hand now on Bauer's arm and spoke in a tone of fatherly kindness. "We are all liable to err," he said, "but try not to let yourself be dragged into any such meanness again. A repentant apology will make good what you have done. That is all that anyone can demand of you. But do not be offended if I warn you that you will not gain your own respect, nor any inward peace, if you go on in this way. And self-respect is what every man needs who would be a man worthy the name. Oh, one thing more. Why did you run away that night? You know, when you had the headache several days ago?" I thought it was Erlock in the parlor. I could only see his shoulder, his arm and back. It was the same uniform." "Oh," said Muller. "Very well, then. Now, good night. I am very sleepy. Remember what I have told you. You will find it is for your own good." Bauer stood motionless, his head drooping, his arms at his side. He looked very unhappy. When he realized that Muller was no longer speaking, he raised his head heavily and with difficulty and looked at the older man with dim eyes. "Well, won't you give me your hand for good night?" Muller's tone was quite gentle and friendly. Bauer started, stretched out both hands, and a sob wrung itself up out of his heart. Muller's eyes were dim in sympathy, and for quite some little time he endured the heavy pressure of the bookkeeper's strong hand. Finally he said, with his usual great good nature, "Hadn't you better go now? I think one thumb is gone. And besides, you know we really can't stand here all night like a couple of women saying good-bye after a coffee party." Bauer dropped the other's hand. "Oh, how kind you are," he stammered. "You are so gentle with me. You even give me your hand. You don't think I am quite impossible. I thank you, I thank you for what you have done. Oh, come, what a very romantic-minded person you are." Bauer set his teeth hard and spoke haltingly, but more as if trying to hold back the words than as if forcing them out. "If only any human being in all the world had ever really loved me, then I wouldn't be so filled up with envy and hatred and bitterness and malice. Even my own mother never loved me. She was always cold and hard and perfectly pitiless towards the very faults that I had inherited from her, and the rest of the world paid no attention to me, or if they did, it was only to laugh at me." "Oh, no, you are mistaken," interrupted Muller. "Have I not seen every day now how kind the Plones are to you, and how they appreciate your good qualities?" Yes, that is really true," murmured Bauer, and his face brightened as if he had made a pleasant discovery. Then he asked another question. "But how did you ever recognize me just from the Probst Mauseit?" "That's not so astonishing," replied Muller with a smile. "We use the phrase very little in this part of the country, and it just so happened that I haven't heard it since I saw it in your letters. Then I suddenly recollected, and although the name was still wrong, I remembered the signature of your letter, and your fright showed me that my conclusions were justified. But don't let us talk about it any more, and don't look so unhappy. You realize that the Plones are fond of you. Is it not a good deal, when kind, intelligent people, such as they are, think well of you? But you'd better go now. They might notice your long absence. Tomorrow they will see that the little difficulty between us is quite settled. I give you my word no one will ever know what the reason for this little difference was. Oh, and please remember that no one here must suspect I am acquainted with Lieutenant Urlock. Do you understand? You must never give even a hint of it." Bauer looked at him seriously. The peculiarity of this circumstance, that Hartmann knew Urlock well enough to have seen the letters, and yet that he had never mentioned the fact of his acquaintance with the young officer in the house of mutual friends, suddenly struck him as odd. He stood silent for a moment, thinking it over. Then a flash came up in his eyes as if he had realized the significance. A question rose to his lips, but he did not dare utter it. He held out his hands again, saying gravely, "I will not mention it. Good night." Then he walked slowly back through the moonlit garden to the house. When Muller returned to his own room and went to bed, his sleep was deep and untroubled. The little diversion from the more strenuous current of his thoughts had done him good. When he awoke the next morning, his pulse was calm and regular. He was in excellent condition, mentally and physically. The maid who brought his breakfast tray at 8 o'clock found him standing at the open window, gazing into the sunny morning landscape. In Fanny's opinion, there was nothing particularly inspiring about the Black Moor, but it seemed to have put Mr. Hartmann into the very best of spirits as he came up to the table on which he had just set the abundantly spread tray. "Why, my dear child," he laughed, "you bring me more every day. Do you expect me to eat all that? What would happen to my waistline if I did? You're too kind to me, you and Mistress Cook. It's time I showed my gratitude. Here, this is yours, and take the other to the presiding goddess of our kitchen." Fanny blushed in pleasure as she took up the 2 20-crown notes that the guest laid on the table. When she had shut the door behind her, Muller said to himself, "Well, that's settled. Now I'll put something for Wilhelm under the brush there. When you're going into battle as I am, it's best to arrange these little things beforehand." Muller enjoyed his breakfast thoroughly, then packed his trunk and his grip, looking out of the window from time to time as he did so. When everything was in its place and there was nothing more to be done, Muller could devote himself entirely to the inspection of the surrounding scenery, and it appeared to interest him more than ever that morning. It was nearly 10 o'clock when he saw a peddler coming towards him along the street, quite an ordinary peddler, such as might be seen anywhere along the country roads. Muller's eyes watched this peddler carefully. When the man came along the road to a point right under the window of the pavilion, he stopped, doffed his hat, and said respectfully, "Can I show the gentleman some cuff buttons or an eyeglass cord? And I have some fine new suspenders, too." Muller replied that he did not need anything just now, and asked the man how business was these days. "Very good, thank you, sir. Everything is in order, and arranged as well as anyone could wish." Muller seemed pleased to find someone who did not complain of poor business, for he waved a friendly hand to the man before he left the window. As he turned back into the room, he smiled as if content. "This former ne'er-do-weel is turning out quite a useful lad," he thought, and he repeated the words with sudden gravity. "Everything is in order, and all is arranged. I can leave here in 3/4 of an hour." For a span he stood motionless, lost in his thoughts. Then, seeming to awake again to the exigencies of the present, he walked over to a little table that stood between the windows and took up 3 articles that lay there. They were a small but wicked-looking revolver, a little silver whistle, and a small bottle with a very wide mouth. The bottle was closed with a metal cap and contained a clear liquid. Muller put the revolver in his right coat pocket and hid the whistle in his vest. Before he put the little bottle in its place, he tried its stopper. This was, as has just been said, a metal cap. A rather deep cap for the size of the bottle, and its outer surface was roughened to make it the more easily handled. With a single, scarcely perceptible turn of his fingers, Muller opened this cap, but he shut it again equally quickly, for in the fleeting instant it was open, the sharp fumes that arose with deadly vigor betrayed the fact that the bottle was filled with chloroform. When Muller had assured himself that the cap was in good working order, he put the bottle in another coat pocket. The pockets of Muller's coats were all of unusual capacity, were lined with leather, and had little inner compartments, so that heavy objects carried in these pockets could not move about as he walked and attract attention from the outside. Now that he had equipped himself for the serious business of this day, he left his room and went over to the factory. He sought out the manager, chatted with him a while, and asked casually whether Plone intended to remain in his office the rest of the morning. Plone replied in the affirmative. While Muller was in the office, Bauer entered on some business errand. "Say, what was the matter with you two last evening?" Plone asked at once. Bauer blushed hotly, but Hartmann answered calmly. "It was a little matter that concerned no one but ourselves. Mr. Bauer came to my room last evening, and we talked it over and settled it quite satisfactorily." This might not have been an explanation, but it was a decided hint in protest of further curiosity. Plone understood, but he was not offended, for he knew that Hartmann was saving Bauer some embarrassment. The bookkeeper's expression of the evening before had plainly shown that whatever it was, he was at fault. Muller stayed in the office until 11:15, then he bade farewell to the manager and walked down the road to Rose Cottage. He walked slowly, his head bowed, and at times a deep breath that was almost a sigh welled up from his very heart. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. I am the man with the black cord. Rose Cottage lay on a main road, and not far from it was a neat little country inn. The inn was an old building with a wide courtyard and a large garden stretching far away from the back of the house. One end of this garden, with its fencing of high green hedge, was separated only by a small strip of grassy meadow from Maximov's property. Just as Muller passed the inn, 2 closed cabs drove in under the archway of the old-fashioned building. There was nothing remarkable in this, for although the inn was little used by the more well-to-do inhabitants of the neighborhood, it was quite a gathering place for cabmen who had brought a fare out into the country and were resting a bit before returning to town. One thing, however, was noticeable on this occasion, and that was that the 2 wagons did not stop in the courtyard as usual, but drove right through down to the furthest end of the garden. Also, the observer might have seen that the curtains on all the windows of the cabs were drawn. But there was no one to notice this, for there was no one in the courtyard of the inn except the host of the Eagle himself, who stood in his doorway. "Drive right on in, there's no one in the courtyard nor in the garden, and the key is in the gate." This was what he said to the leading driver. The 2 cabs drove on unseen, down to the gate in the fence, which was hidden by a thick hedge. Through this gate one could pass out onto the meadows which lay between the inn and Rose Cottage. The latter was protected from the outer world by a very high brick wall, having a handsome entrance gate on the street side. But there was a smaller gate at the back, opening onto the meadow. No one living in Rose Cottage knew that this back gate had been unlocked since early morning, that it had been opened from the outside, and that the garden was now accessible to anyone. When the cab stopped in front of the inn garden gate, 5 men alighted from the closed wagons, slipped through the gate, across the grassy lane, and into the garden of Rose Cottage. One of these men was Constable Kern, a second wore the uniform of a city police official. The 3 other men in plain clothes were heavily built individuals with calm eyes and indifferent mien. The 5 men slipped from one bush to another, safely hidden from the house, until they had come several yards from the gate. Here they stopped on the near side of the circle of a peculiarly cut box which surrounded a young cedar. One of the men carried a spade and immediately began to dig at the earth with it. The two other men in plain clothes continued their creeping progress toward the house. With a little care, they could come quite near the dwelling without being seen, as Maximov's fondness for arrangements of evergreens gave them sufficient cover. There was no dog in Rose Cottage, and the two maidservants were busy in the house. When the two men had come quite close to the dwelling house, they stood, watching and listening, without going further. The bell of the front gate shrilled through the quiet air. The long window opening onto the terrace was thrown back, and a carefully dressed gentleman came out, whistling a merry tune. He laid down the magazine he carried onto a little table and walked on down the few steps from the terrace. "That's him," whispered one of the listeners to his companion. They crouched down the more carefully behind the evergreens. Maximov turned on the top step and looked back at the house. "Stay where you are," he called to the woman who appeared at the door. "I'll open the gate, but don't forget to bring us in something to eat. I am very hungry." "No, sir, I'll attend to it. Mrs. Schober told me what to get for you," answered the woman, who was evidently the cook, before she disappeared from the doorway. The doctor had turned the corner of the house, and the men behind the evergreens could no longer see him. But in a few moments he returned, arm in arm, with his guest. "Don't you want to look at my newly blossoming chrysanthemums?" asked Maximov. "They are white as milk, and most unusually beautiful." He pulled his guest gently in the direction of the conservatory, but the latter did not follow the pressure. "No, my dear doctor," he said. "I want to talk to you about something much more serious today. Can't we go into the house? It will be easier for me to talk to you in your attractive study. And I have something to tell you that will surprise you greatly." "Oh, indeed." "Yes, it is the physician I came to see today, not the friend alone." The two men stood on the terrace now, in front of the long open window. "You aren't well?" the men behind the bushes heard Maximov say. "I noticed it yesterday. At least you are not as calm as usual." "No," replied Hartmann, leaning on the railing as if for support. "I was very restless yesterday, as I have been for several days. There is a crisis coming on again. I know it in this unnatural excitement, this fear that is on me. Can't we leave this window open when we are in the room? I need the air." Hartmann passed through into the study as he spoke. The doctor followed him with a shake of the head. But he hospitably fulfilled his guest's wishes at once, threw open the other half of the window, drew a light table and two comfortable armchairs up to the threshold, and invited his friend to make himself comfortable. "Well then, doctor," began Mr. Hartmann. Then he paused and looked about distrustfully. "No one can overhear us." "No, no one." "Could not Mrs. Schober or Sonia suddenly come in?" "They are in Vienna today." "Oh yes, you told me about it. I remember now. But your servants?" "The coachman is in the city with the ladies. The cook has just returned to the kitchen, and the other maid is busy upstairs." The doctor smiled at his guest's nervousness. "Well, if you are really sure that no one can hear us—" Mr. Hartmann looked very anxious and nervous. Maximov's face grew grave. He laid his hand on his visitor's arm and spoke gently and soothingly. "You are really very nervous today, dear friend," he said. "We all have these little troubles now and then. Tell me frankly what the matter is. But first of all we will quiet your nerves by giving you something good to eat. It's the best thing in the world." He touched an electric bell on the wall near him. "The cook will bring us a light lunch, and when she has gone we can lock the doors behind her, draw our chairs quite close together while we are enjoying the refreshments. Does that program appeal to you?" Mr. Hartmann took the hand that was stretched out to him and pressed it warmly. "There's no reason why it shouldn't," he said. "I feel calmer already. You have something that is almost like hypnotism in your strength. I feel as if you could force me to believe you, whether I wanted to or not." "Is that really true?" asked the doctor, and his eyes gleamed. "But here's our lunch," he said as the door opened. He rose from his chair and examined the contents of the various plates and dishes on the big silver tray. "There, this looks all right. Now bring us over those cigars," said the doctor to the cook, "and then you can vanish again. And see that I am not disturbed under any circumstances. I am not at home to any one now." "Very well, sir." When the woman had brought over the cigars and cigarettes and had left the room, Maximov locked the three inner doors of the study and came back to the table. He sought out the choicest morsels for his guest, but Mr. Hartmann seemed to have very little appetite that morning. He had scarcely taken a few bites when he pushed back his plate and said in a voice that was not natural with him. "You are very kind, doctor, but I cannot eat. I really cannot. My throat seems closed up." This was the actual truth. The soft-hearted Muller was really suffering from some of the symptoms of excitement and anxiety which he had described. Maximoff himself was quite alarmed now. He put down his knife and fork, took a hasty swallow of brandy, then reached over the table and caught at his guest's hand. "Why, your hand's like ice," he said, "and your pulse is beating unnaturally fast. It's time we looked into this matter. Do you think you would have confidence in me as a physician? Although I have practiced general medicine very little, I am really only a specialist in mental problems." Mr. Hartmann wiped his brow, which was bedewed with sweat, and answered hoarsely, "That is why I came to you." "What? I do not understand." The doctor looked up. "It is not my body that is sick." "But I never should have thought—" "That my soul is sick?" Hartmann straightened up in his chair with a short laugh, while a look of cunning brightened his eyes. His arms lay on the side rests of the chair, and his fingers drummed the measure of a merry march, as if he were in the very best of spirits. He looked just a little malicious and decidedly mischievous. The doctor was leaning towards him and looking at him with the greatest interest. Finally he said slowly, "And now, Mr. Hartmann, tell me all about it." "That's why I'm here." "Well, then?" "You'll probably think me a fool." "No, you are quite mistaken." "Oh, yes. Yes, you will," insisted the guest, with a threatening look. Maximoff had spent years in the study of mental alienation. It had been his chief interest since his youth. The unbalanced mind, the sick soul, was the one thing which absorbed all his mental powers. He possessed almost every important work written on this subject, and had had many an opportunity to study actual cases. It was natural, therefore, that he should be most curious at this sudden turn in the behavior of a man whom he had known quite intimately now for several weeks, and who had always appeared to him absolutely normal and sane. And now this man came to him acting in a way that was decidedly not normal, telling him himself that there was something wrong with his mind, and certainly looking it. Maximoff knew all the symptoms, particularly this sudden cunning, this unmotivated merriment. He was certain that he was in the presence of a man whose mind was affected. He was very sorry for Hartmann, whom he had grown to like. But his love for the study of the sick mind overcame his pity for his friend. He pulled his chair nearer to his visitor and began his questioning. "Well, suppose you are right," began the doctor with a delicate smile. "What do you say now?" "I say that you are still mistaken." "Indeed? Then you mean to say—" "I mean to say that I know what the matter with me is and who I really am. And I know that there are moments like those yesterday when I come near betraying myself." "Oh, I see. You are afraid that although you are mentally quite normal, others will think you insane?" "That is it exactly." "And why do you fear that?" "Because I cannot always control myself. Because every now and then I am forced to do what they insist upon." "Who are they?" "Had I better tell you that?" Hartmann's eyes took on a renewed look of sly cunning. "You are quite safe in telling me," said Maximoff, lighting a cigarette and handing his guest the box of cigars. Hartmann took one and smoked so hastily that he was soon surrounded by a pale cloud. The doctor pulled his chair still nearer. He did not want to lose the changing expressions on the other's face. "Well, aren't you going to tell me?" he said, as Hartmann sat staring ahead of him and smiling weirdly. "I can't tell you," he murmured finally. "Why can't you?" "Because they have no names." "I don't understand." "You'll understand as soon as I tell you more. But first I want to know if you can give me some medicine." "What sort of medicine do you want?" "I want something to quiet my nerves, something to give me back the control over myself, so that I do not draw people's attention to me by some ridiculous stupidity." "What stupidity do you mean?" "Why, yesterday, for instance. You saw how absurdly I acted. And didn't you notice how they all looked at me when I nearly upset the wine-glass, and then when I laughed at Bauer's remark, and said such stupid things?" "Yes, I did notice it." "Well, there you see, and I do not want to draw people's attention to me." "Why not?" "Because if I do attract too much attention, then I'm done for." "Now I don't understand you at all." "I believe that. You haven't the faintest idea of who I really am." "Aren't you Robert Hartmann, landowner from Poland?" Maximoff's guest laughed heartily. He beat his hands on his knees and choked in the violence of his merriment. "Robert Hartmann," he repeated, and could scarcely say the words clearly so shaken was he by his fits of laughter. Finally he had controlled himself, and now it was he who pulled his chair nearer to the other. "You are quite sure no one can hear us?" he whispered. The doctor shook his head. "No one. We are quite undisturbed here," he replied soothingly. "You are such a versatile man," continued the other. "You are not only a physician, you are a philosopher as well, and I understand you are interested as a philosopher in every phase of mental abnormality." "Yes, certainly, certainly." "And among other things, in one branch of the science of the soul which is most illuminating." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean you are greatly interested, or I have understood that you are, in crime and criminals. Or rather," Hartmann punctuated his remarks with a scornful gesture, "or rather in that which the weaklings and the cowards call crime." A golden gleam shot up in the doctor's dark eyes, and a peculiar smile curved his well-cut mouth. "A great many of the books in your splendid library concern this fascinating chapter of human existence." Hartmann continued to speak without waiting for any answer. "And I notice that for years you have been collecting all those copies of our leading newspapers which give reports of important criminal cases of recent times." "Yes, you are right. But why do you speak of that now?" "I will explain in a few moments. You believe, then, that I am Robert Hartmann from Poland, landed proprietor and respectable house owner?" "Well?" Maximov's face expressed great interest. The golden gleams in his dark eyes clustered to brilliant points of light. "But I'm not. I'm somebody else," said his guest, looking about anxiously. "But you're the only person I shall tell the truth to." His eyes closed to narrow slits, and his voice took on a threatening tone as he continued. "Professional etiquette demands that you should hold my confidence an absolute secret. Therefore I am going to make you a confession that I must make to someone, or I shall go mad. I know that I would really become insane if I could not tell somebody who I am." The doctor breathed quicker. His face flushed, and his voice was hoarse as he asked, "Who are you, then?" His guest bent over until their faces almost touched, and whispered, "If you look over the files of your newspapers from 1892 until 1906, you will see that during these years 31 murder cases occurred in Vienna, murder cases of which robbery was the motive. 24 of the criminals were caught. Notice this, only 24. 7 remained undiscovered and free. On the 15th of April, 1892, the woman Schramm, keeper of a little tap room in the 15th district, was murdered. On the 8th of August, 1897, Thomas Brabenek was discovered stabbed to death in a grove outside the city. On the 26th of May, 1904, an old woman by the name of Farron, widow of a railway switchman, was found dead in her house. Please notice how easily these figures come to me. There are certain dates one does not forget." "Well, go on," said Maximov eagerly. His face had regained its usual clear pallor, but the gleam in his eyes had grown wilder, and a wicked smile played about his half-open mouth. His strong white hand held his guest's arm as if in a vice, and his voice sank to a hoarse whisper. Mr. Hartmann smiled also. He was now quite calm, and seemed absolutely cold and indifferent as to the effect of his narrative on the other. There was a tone of scorn in his voice as he took up his story. "The murderers, or rather the murderer, of these 3 unfortunates has never been found. The police and the public are still laboring under the delusion that it was a case of murder for robbery." Maximov's guest laughed aloud as his eyes, bright with mocking merriment, met the Russian's wild gaze. "Absurd, isn't it? As if we, who can make thousands by one blow if we want to, would murder for the sake of a few crowns. Why, I can tell you that the Schramm woman had exactly 7 crowns 18 hellars in her till. Brabenek had less than 6 crowns in his pocket, and the poor old Farron creature hadn't enough money in her whole little hut for me to pay the cab back to my home. But the rest of the world don't understand. The herd of ordinary weaklings can't understand the keen sensation that lies in killing for the sheer sake of killing." Maximov's hand tightened on the arm of his guest with a grip of iron. His face was terrible. It was frozen into a smile that might have expressed the evil of a fiend in hell. His eyes alone were alive. They rested greedily, with a sort of devilish satisfaction, on the man who sat there telling him these things. Muller's hand still held the cigar, which had gone out. "My dear doctor, won't you give me a light?" said the detective calmly. In spite of his self-control, he was anxious to get rid of that deadly grasp on his arm. He lit the cigar again, took a few puffs, and continued. Now you know my secret, but you don't know my name yet. It isn't really necessary that you should know it. It's enough that you know now that I am the mysterious murderer who has given the authorities so many difficult riddles to solve, riddles they have not yet solved. A smile of easy self-satisfaction illumined Muller's face. It was reflected from Maximov's eyes, although the Russian had now become noticeably uneasy. The sympathetic objectiveness with which he listened to the beginning of his guest's recital had vanished entirely. His lips moved as if to speak, and yet he did not speak, while his mouth twitched and his hands clenched and unclenched nervously. The veteran detective, on the other hand, had now regained his habitual self-control, and he was so calm that it was easy for him to continue to play his part thoroughly well. What worries me now, he began again, is the way my nerves are going back on me. As you saw yourself, I draw people's attention to my stupid behavior. I was very much annoyed that it should have happened yesterday in a house where I wished to remain unknown. Maximov started as if a sudden thought had occurred to him. What are you doing there? He exclaimed suspiciously. You forced your way into that house under a false name, and it can't be for a good purpose. Oh, be easy about that, replied the other. No harm will come to any of the Plone family, particularly not to Miss Plone, if that is what is worrying you, through my presence there. But what do you want there, anyway? Repeated Maximov. His guest smiled and sank his voice to a whisper. I want to look on the bunglers who are still fussing about, breaking their stupid heads over my last deed. And, naturally, not finding out anything. Why, they haven't even found the— What last deed do you mean? Interrupted the doctor vehemently. For the last few minutes Muller had held his cigar in his left hand. Now, with a casual, unobtrusive movement, he dropped his right hand into the coat pocket which contained the bottle of chloroform. Then he answered in a tone of astonishment. Why, haven't you understood yet? Of course, it's the Epilogue case, I mean. Maximov sprang from his chair, a hot wave of blood rushing up to his very temples. He looked dazed, bewildered. He pressed both hands to his forehead, measured the length of the room a few times with long strides, then halted suddenly in front of his guest and burst into an uproarious fit of laughter. He put out his hand to a chair as if for support, so greatly was he shaken by the violence of his merriment. Hartmann looked up at him in indignant surprise. Have you gone mad? He exclaimed. Maximov pulled himself together and controlled his laughter with an effort. No, I am not mad, my dear friend, but now I know what's the matter with you. Now it was Muller's turn to spring up. What do you mean by that? He cried harshly, but the doctor patted him on the shoulder and answered soothingly. Oh, nothing at all to offend you. I was simply overcome by the idea that you, Epilogue's murderer, should deliberately come here to watch the people who are hunting for him in vain. Muller bowed as if flattered. The best joke of all happened on a Sunday 2 weeks ago, he began again. The doctor went back to his chair and sat down. The inward merriment against which he was still fighting shone from his eyes and played about his handsome mouth. Oh, please do tell me about it, he asked, biting his lips to keep back the laughter. What happened 2 weeks ago, then? It was Sunday night. I went back to the greenhouse, as I did several times before. And what do you suppose? One of those spying bunglers was there also. A detective, I mean. Must have been the detective you mentioned a little while ago. Oh, that was a detective, was it? I put him out in short order, I can tell you. I fired at him twice, but I'm sorry to say I didn't hit him. Oh, then it was you who did the shooting that night. Then my valet, who came to my help, and I walked back and forth, twisting and curving about the moor. I wanted to cover our trail, for I knew that the fool would be waiting for me, and I didn't want him to see where I was living. But I must say he was cleverer than I thought. We didn't see him again, but he must have followed us. What? Why do you believe that? Cut in Maximov, greatly surprised. I found his footprints in the mud outside the garden gate next morning. Since then I have been in a constant state of surprise, that I should have been left so undisturbed. I don't believe that you would have been left undisturbed if the man had come there in pursuit of you, replied Maximov, emphasizing each word sharply, with a rolling anger in his voice. Then he said, more brightly, I give you my word the man was there by pure accident. But now I want you to tell me how you did that trick in the greenhouse. The whole thing is such a mystery, and I am naturally very curious to hear the explanation of it. He smiled at Muller ironically as he spoke. "It took me many weeks to think it out, to plan it all beforehand, as you may imagine," began the detective. "I hung about the garden wall in the disguise of a peddler and took a wax impression of the 3 keyholes which barred the way to Erlach's room. The garden gate and the 2 front doors, the iron one and the inner one. Then I waited for a stormy evening, when the noise of the wind should deaden everything else, climbed over the garden wall, opened the gate from the inside, and opened the house doors. I entered the house and Erlach's study, the door of which I knew was never locked, for the old gentleman might at any moment need the help of his housekeeper. He was aged and feeble, and worried about his health." Muller stopped talking and took a long puff from his cigar. "Well, go on, tell me about it," insisted the doctor. Muller's eyes lit up again in cruel cunning. "Well, then I shot Erlach," he remarked with a smile. The doctor gave a short, hard laugh, then spoke gently. "Well, my friend, go on, tell me the rest." "Then I carried the body out onto the moor," narrated Muller, losing himself again in the enjoyment of his cigar. But Maximoff bent over and almost tore it from his hand as he said, "I want you to talk, not to smoke." "Why, what else is there to talk about?" "The greatest mystery of all, the mystery that no one has yet solved." Maximoff was quite calm as he said this. His only sensation seemed to be an overweening curiosity. "Oh, you mean the garden door bolted from the inside? Well, when I carried the body out, I went back into the garden, locked and bolted the door, and climbed over the wall. That's simple enough." "Yes, that, and the strangling of an old man. That's all very simple," mocked Maximoff. "Any fool can do that." "Oh, now, see here!" exclaimed Muller angrily. "Any fool," repeated Maximoff sharply. Then, with kaleidoscopic suddenness, he was once more the friendly, soothing physician. "Of course, I don't mean you when I say any fool," he continued, "for you have outdone the cleverest criminal I know, the man with the black cord. He himself might be proud of this crime." The doctor's eyes fairly sparkled, and his smile was triumphant. "Why, yes, I am the man with the black cord," remarked Muller, his eyes shining also, and his lips curved in a victorious smile. The doctor sprang up from his chair, ran back and forth through the study with his hands pressed to his temples, then halted again before his guest, and again his uproarious laughter echoed from the walls of the handsome room. "Oh, that's great!" he cried merrily. "That's the most delicious thing I've heard in many a day. You, then, you are the genius of this crime, the unknown whom you yourself first called the man with the black cord?" Again his laughter rang through the room. Then, with another one of his sudden changes, his voice quieted down to gentleness, and he continued, "Well, then, you great man, do explain to me the riddle of the doors locked from the inside, and the disappearance of the strangled victim from the closed room." "Of the shot victim, you mean?" "No, he was strangled. First chloroformed and then strangled, if you want to know the particulars," declared Maximoff in a tone of conviction. "All right, just as you like," replied Muller, with a smile as of satisfied vanity. "Well, first I underscored the 3 words in the old book on the table, then I left it open there and locked the bedroom from the inside. Then I turned the key in the lock of the study door in such a way that it only needed the least little touch to snap the lock." "Well, and then?" Maximoff's breath came quickly, and Muller's hand was clasped tightly around the neck of the chloroform bottle in his pocket. "Then," he went on, "then I took a long, thin iron rod with a hook on the end, which I had brought with me, and when I had left the house, locking both front doors, I went around in front of the sitting-room windows and stood on the bench that is there. I pushed the rod into the room through the open window, and with its hook I could easily catch the key of the door and turn it, snapping the lock. So that, you see, in this way both doors were locked from the inside, and their keys were in the proper place. That was no such great trick, but I committed a blunder here. I had to leave a burning candle on the little table, so that I could see the lock distinctly. I wanted to put out this candle with the end of the rod, but it was difficult to manage it, and I hit the burning wick with such violence that the wax splattered all over the table. Well, doctor, why don't you say something?" Maximoff had sunk down in a heap in his chair, completely absorbed in his thoughts. Finally he raised his head, doubt, anxiety, and scorn striving for the mastery in his face. "And that's why you claim to be the man with the black cord?" he murmured, rising and beginning again his uneasy pacing of the room. Muller rose also. He pushed his chair back so that the door onto the terrace was free, and the heavy armchair stood between him and Maximoff. He had already taken the little bottle of chloroform from his pocket and held it in his closed hand, thumb and first finger in place on the nickel top. Then he waited. At first, Maximov's anger seemed to gain the victory over his warring emotions. Then, a moment later, he controlled himself, and his scorn came uppermost again. He stopped still in the middle of the room, both hands in his pockets, his voice hushed to a quiet, calm tone, while his eyes rested mockingly on those of his guest. "But you haven't finished your story. Where did you hide Erlach's body?" Muller pretended embarrassment. He stared at the doctor as if quite bewildered. "The body? The body? Where did I hide it?" he murmured. Then, after a pause, I hid it." "Well, where did you hide it?" came from between the doctor's set teeth. Muller looked quite helpless. I don't know. I can't remember." "Then hold your tongue!" screamed Maximoff. But Muller persisted obstinately. "All the same, I'm the man with the black cord. Here, look at this. I carry a piece of it with me wherever I go." He held out the bit of cord he had found on Erlach's bed, so that the other could see it. Maximoff stared at it, his face reddened, the veins on his temples pulsed audibly. "You are a fool," he cried. "An impertinent, insolent idiot! How dare you usurp the credit for a genius that you never possessed? Why, you fool, I am the man with the black cord. And I'll crush the life out of you. He could get no further. He choked and gasped and bent forward towards the slight figure of the man who stood opposite him. His powerful hands clenched threateningly, the great muscles of his shoulders stiffening visibly through his coat. Muller made a sudden movement of his right hand, then slipped through the open door onto the terrace. In the same instant, a sharp whistle rang out, and the two men from behind the fir tree dashed into the study. They found the room full of the odor of chloroform, and Maximoff already half overcome by the fumes. He still raged and screamed, striking out with his hands and snapping at his captors with his teeth. But the chloroform had already robbed him of most of his great strength. The frightened women servants rushed to the window and stood there cowering in terror at the noise and at the unexpected sight of several uniformed policemen in the garden. The Viennese official and Constable Kern entered the study, while Mr. Hartmann walked rapidly towards the lower end of the garden. The terrifying shrieks still rang through the house. Then finally, all was still. Sergius Maximoff, bound hand and foot, was thrown down into an armchair by his captors. Even then it took all their strength to hold him until the violence of his outbreak spent itself in the reaction of utter exhaustion. He sat quite still. A sly smile wreathed his lips, and in his eyes shone a satanic determination. The police commissioner stood before him. "Doctor, we are here to arrest you. We have a wagon waiting back of your garden. You can be driven away quietly without being seen. I am taking for granted, therefore, that you will come with me voluntarily, that you will walk there yourself." "If you will take these cords off my feet," replied Maximoff proudly, "I will follow you wherever you say. But you will find, my dear sir, that before this day is over, it will be up to you to ask my pardon humbly. You have made a mistake in your prisoner. The man you are looking for has been living in Mr. Plone's house under the name of Hartmann. It was I who discovered his identity, and I was about to take him prisoner when he overcame me with chloroform and escaped." "We'll find him," remarked the commissioner calmly, and Maximoff continued, "But you must lose no time. I will hold you responsible if he escapes entirely. You may better understand the importance of what I say when I tell you that this Hartmann is the man with the black cord who has Erlach's murder to his credit, as well as the others." The commissioner bowed in silence. At a gesture from him, the attendants loosened the fetters on the Russian's feet. "Very well, we can go now," said Maximoff, rising from the chair. He was so exhausted that the attendants had to support him as they walked from the house and through the garden. A weird smile brightened the Russian's gloomy face as the little group moved slowly over the lawn towards the rear fence. Then they turned the corner of a group of fir trees, and the quiet of the pleasant spot was broken by a terrific scream. Maximoff stood still, his eyes widened, staring at the devastated bed of box which he himself had arranged a few weeks before. The little cedar lay cut down and thrown to one side. The rounded heads of box were torn ruthlessly out and cast in a disorderly heap. Where they had been, the earth was removed from a long, shallow trough, and in this trough lay the body of Leopold Erlach, fully dressed, his nightshirt spread across his legs. "Come, doctor, the cabs are waiting," said the commissioner. But Maximoff did not move. One more gasping shriek, and he fell unconscious to the ground. At this moment, Muller was already out in the road, walking towards the factory. He walked very slowly, his head sunk deep on his breast, his face ghastly pale. When that horrible scream rang through the quiet morning air, he stopped in his walk and turned to look behind him. His fingers worked as if in a cramp, his teeth set firm, and his breath came in a gasp that was a sobbing sigh. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Where the Blow Falls. About an hour after the catastrophe in Rose Cottage, General Manager Plone had already eaten his lunch and was back in his office. He had not taken up the burden of his work yet, but sat leaning back in a comfortable armchair, reading a paper and smoking. His servant Wilhelm hurried in with a card on a salver. "This gentleman wants to see you at once," said the man. Plone looked at him in astonishment and asked, "Why, what is the matter? You're shaking all over." "It's so like him, sir, and yet it isn't him," stammered Wilhelm. Plone shook his head and touched his forehead with one finger. "There's a screw loose with you somewhere," he said, laughing. He looked at the card before him. It bore the name of Joseph Muller. "Show the gentleman in," said Plone, laying aside his paper. The manager was prepared for some surprise after seeing his servant's bewilderment. He watched the door with interest, but when it opened and his visitor entered, Plone himself appreciated what had happened to Wilhelm. The man who stood before him was an inch or so shorter than Hartmann and weighed considerably less. Also, he was quite differently dressed. But apart from this, the resemblance was astonishing. Plone put his hand to his forehead as if fearing for his own brain now, and looked down again at the name on the card. Joseph Muller, he murmured. "I never saw such a likeness before." "Nor did I," said Joseph Muller in Hartmann's voice as he closed the door. The manager, who had risen at the other's entrance, sat down again and stared up at his caller, and seemed too bewildered to find words. "May I sit down?" asked Joseph Muller, pulling a chair near to the desk. "Please do," murmured Plone, wondering to himself whether he were not taking his afternoon nap at the moment and dreaming all this. Then Joseph Muller spoke. "It was under the name of Robert Hartmann from Poland that I enjoyed your delightful hospitality." "Then you are not the man you led us believe you to be?" questioned the manager slowly, as if trying to understand. Muller put his tall hat down on the edge of the table, unbuttoned his black coat, and took a portfolio from his pocket. From this he drew a large card and handed it to Plone. "This is who and what I am," he said. Plone looked at the photograph on the card and the official statement of the police department that accompanied it. His face was very grave as he handed the paper back to Muller. "Then you are a detective?" he said. "Yes, I am a detective. I think I need not tell you that I came here to investigate the Ehrlich case." "I imagined that was it. But my chief, the Baron, knows who it is that he sent to me?" "Naturally, I could not have come without his assistance. This may be some excuse for my presence here." "You need no excuse, Mr. Muller. You are a welcome guest, and you have endeared yourself to us all." Muller bowed and pressed the other's hand warmly. "And now I have come to thank you for all your kindness, your sincere cordiality." Plone looked down at the little man before him, whose face was so grave and who seemed struggling to suppress a sadness which threatened to overcome him. "Then are you going away?" the manager asked. "You have not been successful here? They're going to send another detective?" "I am going away because there is nothing more to do here." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Ehrlich's murderer has been discovered and is already in security." "At last! Oh, but wait a minute. I mustn't be the only one to hear that. Let's go over and join the ladies." Plone rose from his chair, but Muller shook his head. "Please sit down again, Mr. Plone. I cannot tell the ladies what I have to tell you." "Why not?" "Please, won't you sit down?" There are moments in the lives of all of us when we have the instant recognition that something terrible is nearing us. We do not know what it is, nor from what side it is coming, but we know that it is coming and that it is something horrible. For the first time in his life, the robust, good-natured, and easygoing Plone realized that such a moment had come for him. He sat down, drew a deep breath, and looked up anxiously at his visitor. "I could not tell your sister especially, not at least until you know," said Muller low. Plone bent forward in his chair in evident excitement. He swallowed hard several times, then spoke with difficulty. What? What do you mean? It is you who must tell Miss Suzanne. Muller, too, was hoarse. I don't understand you, murmured Plone. Oh, yes, you understand me perfectly well. Mr. Hartmann, Mr. Muller, I left Rose Cottage less than an hour ago. It's some mistake, some horrible mistake, gasped the manager. Unfortunately, there is no mistake possible here. Sergius. Sergius is not his name. Maximoff. That is not his name. If it is thought that he killed Erlach, it is known that he killed Erlach. Then he did it in anger. He is easily aroused and passionate, and he is so strong, a death blow might be given before he thought it. It was a murder, a carefully prearranged murder, a crime that was carried out with the same care, the same cleverness, and the same daring as the... Plone's icy hand caught at Muller's fingers, scarcely less icy. His eyes seemed starting from their sockets. Muller finished his sentence, as were the other crimes that he has committed. Plone tried to speak, but only gasped. For he is the man with the black cord. Plone's face was ghastly, and on Muller's brow the great beads of perspiration stood out. He wiped them away, then he continued sadly. You see how I am obliged to reward all your hospitality, but I have one comfort for you. A comfort? How could there be any comfort here? Maximoff is insane. Plone looked up, startled afresh. Is that not some comfort to you? Asked the detective. He did not know whether Plone had even heard him. The poor man sat there frozen to stone, looking out into blankness with eyes that were dumb in grief. In this horrible moment he first realized how fond he had grown of Maximoff. Then he thought of his sister, and a shudder ran through every fiber of his robust frame. For he realized that it was he who must tell this girl, so dear to him, this woman happy in her love, dreaming of how a few weeks more would make her a happy wife, he must tell her that the man she loved was the monster who had held the entire neighborhood in terror for so long. When he realized what the truth had meant to him, the strong man, he shuddered to think of the crushing blow it would be to her. He groaned aloud and covered his face with his hands. He sat thus for many minutes, and Muller, too, was quite still. He understood the other's suffering, and he gave him time to recover from the first shock. It was very quiet in the comfortable little office. A soft hum of distant noises came from the direction of the factory, but within the room nothing was heard except the ticking of the clock and the deep gasping breath of the stricken man. Finally Plone raised his head and straightened himself up in his chair. He had conquered the first dreadful moment of the shock. A certain frozen calm came into his face. Now you can tell me what you have to tell." His voice sounded hard. Muller told his story. He told of how he had received the first hint when he saw the picture of Napoleon which Maximoff had shown him as one of his art treasures, and of which he already knew that it had been in Erlach's possession up to 2 days before the latter's disappearance. He spoke of the visit of the detective Grang at Rose Cottage and told the story of the journey to Russia. He described his visit to old Andreas Maximoff in Wenden, and that it was there he had first heard about Nikolai Simarenko, which was the true name of the man who was betrothed to Suzanne. Old Maximoff had told him much of the past of this nephew, and had told him also that Simarenko came of a family in which the trait of insanity was hereditary. When he reached this part of the story, Plone gave a sigh of relief. "Oh, thank God, he exclaimed. "Then at least he is not responsible for his terrible deeds." Muller nodded. "You are right," he continued. "Nikolai Simarenko is an unfortunate man. His mind is held in bondage by a terrible delusion. Listen now. He knew of the hereditary taint in his blood, and even as a youth, although he was strong and well, he suffered tortures in the thought that he might fall a victim to the curse that weighed so long upon his family. He took up the study of medicine, hoping that through his knowledge in this field he would be able to save himself from the threatened disaster. It was natural under the circumstances that the specialty to attract him should be mental alienation. He was an excellent student, too much so for his own good. About 12 years ago, he and his cousin, whose name he is now bearing, took their degree at the University of Vienna. Then they both returned home. Sergius Maximoff brought his own people the good news that his cousin Nikolai had returned to his home in the best of health and spirits. Then the real Maximoff went on a tour of the world and settled in South Africa, where all news from him soon ceased. Nikolai Simarenko remained in Russia, married and lived happily with his wife for about 3 years. He devoted himself to his studies, alas, too deeply. He had always been well-to-do, and now, through a legacy, he had become a very rich man. But he did not spend his days in the usual enjoyments indulged in by other rich young men. He was always of a reserved disposition, and he became more so as time passed on. He had few friends and seemed interested only in his studies. He and his wife traveled much until Sonia was born. Then the young couple were obliged to remain at home, for Sonia's mother never recovered her health after the birth of the child. Her husband scarcely left her bedside. He sent for the most renowned specialists from St. Petersburg and Berlin, but none of them could bring relief to the sufferer. It was he himself who finally put an end to his wife's pain. She was found one morning in her bed, strangled. Around her throat was a bit of black cord which had literally put an end to her suffering. The family curse had fallen. The hereditary insanity had broken out in Simarenko. There was no doubt about it, for he himself quite calmly acknowledged that he had deliberately killed the wife whom he loved more than anything else in the world, because he could not bear to see her suffer. He was proud of what he had done, and who shall say that his pride was altogether unjustified? It was this attitude of his that seemed so abnormal to those around him, and they committed him to an asylum. I visited this asylum, continued Muller, and I soon convinced myself that it would not take any great cunning to escape from it. Simarenko had been there scarcely a year before he got away, doubtless helped by a judicious use of money. On the night of his flight he stopped in at his own house, took his little girl, and the two disappeared from Russia. How he ever managed to pass the frontier with the child will perhaps never be explained, and there is something else equally important which is equally likely to remain a mystery. He had no immediate relatives, and when he was put in the asylum, the state took charge of his fortune. To the surprise of everyone, there was no money there. His entire fortune seemed to have disappeared entirely. The narrator paused and took a sip from a glass of water that stood on the table. Had that anything to do with Maximoff? With that man's insanity? Asked Plone. Muller shrugged his shoulders. What I think, he replied, is that Maximoff, I cannot get away from the name either, utilized his various journeyings to invest his fortune quietly in some other country. Russia is very uncertain financially as well as politically, and his actions in this respect would seem to show a sane and normal mind. Was he insane when he killed his wife? Asked Plone again. Again the detective shrugged his shoulders, and he answered this question with another. Is it a sign of insanity when a physician decides to end the suffering of a patient whom he knows to be in acute pain and incurable? Again there was silence in the room until Muller took up his story. Since his flight from the asylum, all knowledge of Nikolai Simarenko was lost in Russia. But the physicians of the institution have not lost interest in their unfortunate colleague. I did not tell them the reason for my inquiries, for I wanted unbiased information. I called myself a former Viennese acquaintance of his, who came into that neighborhood by chance, had heard of Simarenko's sad case, and now wished to know more about it. One of the physicians, a kindly elderly gentleman, told me that Dr. Simarenko's insanity was of an unusual sort. It concerned one corner of his brain alone, as it were, and as such it might be considered as having started fresh with him, although he said it was not possible to doubt the existence of an inherited inclination to mental abnormality. But it was fear of the dread fate, his ardent wish to escape it, his hot desire to shield himself through knowledge, the mental overwork and constant occupation with one train of thought. These were the stages of the journey made by Simarenko until he reached the dread goal of broken nerves and outspoken insanity. Psychiatry and its allied branches of study had made Simarenko a madman, and the worst misfortune that befell him was that while in Vienna he had had as a classmate a Hindu student with whom he had become warm friends. This man taught him to believe in the doctrine of the transmigration of souls. "Oh, yes, yes, he used to speak of it sometimes," threw in Plone. "Has that anything to do with his madness?" "A great deal. It was the most important factor connected with the crimes he has committed here." "Please tell me what you mean." As a natural connection with his studies of psychology, Nikolai Simarenko came to take a great interest in the soul of the criminal. I don't know whether you have noticed that there were so many books on criminal psychology in his library. He himself told me on one of my visits to Rose Cottage that what interested him most along the wide field of medical science was what the unthinking mass called the sinister perversities of the human soul. Even then his expression, as the unthinking mass call it, struck me, for it was evident that he did not consider himself one of the mass. The old Russian doctor in the asylum told me that while he was there, Simarenko openly avowed his admiration for several of the famous criminals of history, those types of men who had learned to kill for the pure joy of killing. Oh, this is terrible! Azzolino di Romano, Nero, and men of that stamp seemed to be the ideal of this gifted young man who in his normal moments represented the best type of warm-hearted and highly intelligent modern scholar. He also took the greatest possible interest in that half-mythical character, the court jeweler Cardillac, who is said to have lived in the time of Louis XIV and to have perpetrated a long series of mysterious crimes. What seemed to particularly interest him in Cardillac was his love for strange and odd pieces of jewelry. He seemed to believe that the souls of these great criminals of history entered by turn into his own in his sick moments, and ordered all his doings, for which he was not otherwise responsible. One of the patients in the institution wore an odd and beautiful ring to which Simarenko seemed greatly attracted. The man was found dead in bed one morning, and his ring missing. At first the cause of death was not apparent, but at the autopsy it was discovered that a tiny nail was driven deep into the victim's skull. After Simarenko's flight from the asylum, the missing ring, also a miniature portrait of the head doctor's son, were discovered in the mattress of his bed. "Oh, this is terrible, terrible!" cried Plone, shuddering. "Yes, it is, indeed, terrible," repeated Muller. "And I think it was high time that the man was discovered and rendered harmless. High time for Miss Suzanne, and for his own little girl, Sonia." Plone looked up with a horror in his eyes that seemed to rob him of words. The detective continued. "Those earrings which Simarenko gave Miss Suzanne. You remember, he said, that he brought them from Russia? They had formerly belonged to Urlach. You remember my excitement at the moment? I had found a description and a drawing of the jewels among the dead man's papers, and the earrings themselves were not in his cabinet, nor was there any clue to their whereabouts. With his mania for murder, Simarenko combined a tendency here and there to make away with property of others. But it was never for any other reason than to obtain some cherished art treasure, or in some cases, to make up for the niggardliness of his victim. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" "On my secret visits to the greenhouse," explained Muller, "I found reason to think that about 20,000 crowns were missing from Urlach's capital. I learned accidentally that immediately after Urlach's disappearance, Maximoff had given 40,000 crowns to endow 2 free beds in a Viennese hospital. Yesterday I made an official investigation of this matter and discovered that one of the beds was registered under endowed by L.E. and the other N.S. Old Urlach, as you know, was very close with his money and anything but generous. His murderer set the old miser a monument which the other scarcely deserved, and at the same time he gave a neat little sum out of his own property. But I must say that I did not like his giving his future wife the earrings which had belonged to his latest victim." Yes, I understand. I feel the same way myself. But are you sure, absolutely sure, that those were Urlach's earrings?" "Yes, there is no doubt possible. They were a very odd design, and besides the description and drawing, which I told you I found in some of the old family papers, you can see another picture of them yourself in the family portrait hanging in the drawing-room of the Urlach house." Have they found Urlach's body?" "Yes. Simarenko had buried it in his garden." "Then they have arrested him already?" Plone sighed deeply as he spoke, and Muller's voice was sad as he answered the question. "They took him away about 2 hours ago. Just before I came here, the commissioner, who remained in Rose Cottage some little while after the arrest, told me he had made interesting discoveries in the little room which the doctor called his photographing darkroom. It was used for this purpose, but for other purposes as well. In a cupboard in this room, the commissioner found a long dark cloak with a high, stiff-lined hood in which holes were cut out for the ears. Also several pairs of gloves of remarkably fine and flexible kid, and boots with very high heels and heavy soles, which were fastened into felt slippers. Also there was a little strong-box in the cupboard, which contained a paper missing among Urlach's securities. And something more was found there, a big coil of horsehair lariat, bits of which we have already seen. Oh, yes, the black cord. Why did he use that in his crimes? Who can tell the vagaries a sick soul may have? He had bought a lariat once as a curiosity for his collection of foreign weapons. The strength and flexibility of the narrow cord seemed to appeal to him, and it was with this that he strangled his wife. It became afterward a sort of a fad with him, a vanity, as it were, that he should leave his trademark behind him whenever he had committed a crime. But I still don't understand why none of us ever recognized the man's condition. Just think how often he was in our house, how intimate our friendship was. But you told me yourself that you had never seen much of him until he became interested in your sister, and that you were never really intimate with him until the two were engaged. This is but little over 2 months now, I believe. Yes, you are right, said Plone. Before that he lived like a hermit. None of us really knew anything about him. And madmen of his stamp are wonderful actors. It is hardly to be called acting even, for I feel assured that in the man's normal moments he had but very little realization of what he did when the fit was on him. His really unusual and well-trained mind asserted its sovereignty even in his hours of madness. Therefore all his crimes were carefully planned and carried out with an audacity which proved the man of great intelligence. It did not seem possible that he could sit and talk to us so calmly about these very crimes if he were always, when normal, conscious of what his other self had done. And in his normal moments he was certainly a man of most unusual ability and charm, one of those rare beings whom one does not meet very often. Yes, that's what makes it so dreadful, cut in Plone. I have seldom seen a man who combined so many good qualities. All the more terrible that such a brain should have been overthrown, continued Muller. In fact, it did not occur to me that the man was actually mad. When I first began to suspect him, I thought myself obliged to believe him one of the greatest criminals of modern times. Then one day I happened by accident to see the title of a well-known book on criminal psychology, and I remembered its contents, which were well known to me. There have been other cases similar to his, but they are to be found at rare intervals. I myself didn't realize how terrible they could be until I had it brought home to me. You're going already? Asked Plone hastily as Muller rose from his chair. There are some more details, which might interest you, said the detective, but we can postpone the telling of them for another time. I am very tired now, and I must make up my official report. Plone realized that his guest looked tired, and he touched the bell on his desk. Let me order you something to eat, he said, going to the door as the attendant came. They sat in silence until the tray was brought, and as Muller ate the cold meat and drank the wine, it seemed to restore and rest him. Plone waited on him anxiously, with a request in his eyes which he dared not yet make. Muller looked up suddenly from the tray and remarked, One thing I must tell you in justice to my valet Karl, who is not my valet but a professional assistant. I did not dismiss him from my service as I had to tell you that I did. I wanted to get him out of the way so that I could send him on the Russian journey with Simarenko. You feel better now, more rested? Asked Plone, handing his guest the box of cigars. Yes, thank you. I think it was partly hunger, although I am tired. But I generally find that I can keep up when there is something to do. If your profession brings you many such experiences as you have gone through today, it must be hard on mind and body. Muller sighed. Yes, this did touch me deeply. I had grown very fond of the man. It's this fool heart of mine that gives me so much trouble. It steps in when I want to be most professional, and if it doesn't actually lead me into doing unprofessional things, it makes me suffer, as I have done today. It's just this kind heart of yours, and your wide experience that gives me the courage to ask something of you. Plone spoke hesitatingly, as if trying to find the words. Muller looked up without answering. Plone took a fresh start. I want you to help me tell Suzanne, he almost groaned. Oh, no, no. Yes, you must. I am helpless here. She is all I have left besides my own family. She is very dear to me. I am awkward and clumsy. These things are beyond me. I don't know how to put it so that it would not kill her at once. You would know. You have been through so many cases of suffering and sorrow that your own work must have brought about. She likes you and has confidence in you. She knows that you liked him. You must tell her. You must help me tell her. Plone's voice sank to a pathetic note of pleading that was touching in the contrast of its helplessness with his robust frame and fresh, wholesome face. Muller paused a moment, then rose heavily and slowly from his chair. Very well, then, he said. If you wish it, I will do what I can. Plone seized his hand and wrung it hard, stammering incoherent thanks. Together the men walked from the office through the covered passageway to the house. As they entered the cheerful sitting room, Suzanne was there alone, sewing at a window. She sprang up and came to meet them with a merry welcome. "Why, this is delightful! I hardly expected you to this hour of the day. Why, I beg your pardon. I thought it was Mr. Hartmann." "It is the man you have known as Hartmann," said Muller slowly. "But what? But you are so different today. I don't understand." Suzanne turned her eyes towards her brother as if to ask explanation from him. When she saw his drawn and haggard face, she gasped, pressed her hands to her heart, and then exclaimed low, "Oh, what is it? What is the matter? What is it?" The keen-sensed girl felt that some tragedy was in the air. All the gloom of the presentiment that had been hanging over her for the last week or two, in strange contrast to her usually sane and wholesome nature, came back with a rush. It had disappeared the last few days. Her lover's return in such good spirits, their mutual happy plans for the approaching marriage, all the sweet preparations for it that mean so much to a true woman, had served to restore Suzanne to her usual habitude of looking on the brighter side of life only. But at this moment she passed through the hideous ache of anticipation that had a short time back so crushed her brother's more material spirit. Suzanne was a woman of character and accustomed to self-control. She did not cry out now, but stood there quietly waiting. Plone put out his hand, and she laid hers in it, drawing close to him and looking up in his face. "Suzanne," he began, trying to control his own emotion, "this gentleman whom we have known as Mr. Hartmann is the detective, Joseph Muller. He has been our guest because his professional duty demanded it." "Detective? Here on duty?" "He came to find the monster who has terrorized our neighborhood, whom he himself called the man with the black cord." Suzanne drew a step off from her brother. A sound that was almost like a short laugh came from her lips, so great was her sudden relief. "And you have found him?" she exclaimed. "Oh, yes, you have, I see. But I don't see why you should both look so upset. What's that to you, Richard? It seems to have touched you. Was it one of your men?" "No, not one of my men." "Well, who was it then? Who was it? Was it someone we knew? Why, you ought to be glad that he is found, that our homes here are safe once more." "It was someone we all knew," began Plone haltingly. "Oh, who? Who?" Again the black pall of some approaching evil seemed to sink down on Suzanne's heart. Muller came a step forward and spoke. "Miss Plone, this man with the black cord, who is the perpetrator of all these mysterious crimes, including Erlach's disappearance, Erlach's murder, I should say, is not so much a criminal as an unfortunate. He is a madman." "Madman?" asked Suzanne. "Oh, how terrible! And we have had a madman in our midst all this time without knowing it?" "Yes, without knowing it," said Muller, "and I myself was as much surprised by the truth as any of you could have been." "But who is it? Who?" Suzanne's insistence bore a note of fear. Her brother took her hands again and drew her in the shelter of his arms. "Why, Richard," she continued, "I'm not so frightened. I'm no weakling, you know. Of course the thought is unpleasant, but now that the man has been found, we are quite safe. Why, you foolish boy?" "No one suspected the truth," said Muller in the moment's pause that ensued, "because this madman, in his lucid intervals, was one of the most remarkably intelligent and attractive men I have ever met." Suzanne had been looking at the detective even as she spoke to her brother. Now she turned her head to look at the man whose arms still encircled her protectingly. A low, inarticulate note of fear broke involuntarily from her lips as she saw her brother's face. "Richard, who is it? Who is he talking about? What is it that you know? Why do you look so horrified? Why do you hold me so? Who is this man he is talking about? Tell me, do tell me." Plone only held her closely and looked helplessly at Muller. "You will have need of all your courage, Miss Suzanne," said the detective, "to bear this shock which is to come to you. It has almost crushed your brother. He has not yet recovered. This madman was dear to us all, and to you. Very dear to you." "To me?" Her voice rose to a higher note. "To me?" she repeated. "Oh!" Here she glanced at them both again, a quick, comprehending glance. "Oh, my God! Not—" "Yes," said Plone very low. "It is he." "Sergius!" Suzanne scarcely breathed the name as she swayed in her brother's protecting arms. "Oh, no, no, no! Oh, it is ridiculous! I don't believe you! You are both gone crazy! It is you who are madmen!" Her brother only held her tighter as Muller spoke very gravely. "No, it is no mistake, unfortunately. This man who had won all our hearts, this highly gifted man of great talent, was the victim of a taint of hereditary insanity, which took a homicidal course." Suzanne gave a low moan and covered her face with her hands. She would have fallen had not Plone held her tightly. "My poor Suzanne," he murmured, "my poor, dear girl." "Let me think," she said very slowly. "I can't grasp it. Then if he did all these terrible things, oh, but I can't believe it, I can't." "You must, dear," said Plone. "It is only too true." "But then, hereditary insanity, you say? Then he was not responsible?" "No, thank God, no," explained Plone. "His better self, the man we loved, scarcely realized what he did in his moments of madness. Is it not so?" He turned to Muller with a look of pleading. "Yes, I believe it was so," said the detective. "It made the horror of what I had to do a little less poignant." You did it?" Suzanne shook herself free from her brother's arm and straightened up. "Then you came here to hound him down? You came to us under a false name to watch him? Oh, it was cruel, cruel!" Muller shook his head sadly, and Plone took his sister's hands. "Be just, dear," he said. "He has done only his duty, and he has saved your life, possibly." "What?" "His first wife died." Plone did not finish the sentence, but Suzanne understood. With a scream, she threw herself into his arms again and buried her face on his shoulder, shuddering violently. "He did it to end her sufferings. She was in great pain, and her malady was incurable," said Muller quickly, feeling the horror in the girl's soul. "He knew it was only a question of time. He was a physician, and he ended it. This crime, at least, terrible as it is in our eyes, has much to excuse it." "Because he loved her so greatly," came in smothered tones from Suzanne. "Yes, because he loved her so greatly," repeated Muller. "Then his love, at least, was not madness?" the girl continued mechanically, tonelessly. "No, that was genuine, as were all his good qualities." Suzanne wheeled round suddenly. "Where is he now?" There was a sudden, unnatural calm about her. "They have taken him to the city." "To prison?" "No, to the asylum." "I must go to him. My place is at his side. He loved me. If my love is of any value, it must show itself now. Take me to him." "No, no, dear, you must not think of it," murmured Plone. "Your presence would be of no good to him just now. It might only serve to excite him dangerously." Again she broke from her brother's retaining grasp. "But I must. It is my duty." "There is another duty which calls for you," said Muller. "That poor little girl, now doubly orphaned. So terribly orphaned." "Sonia! Poor little Sonia! Then she too? "Yes, she too was in danger." Muller completed the sentence which the girl did not dare think out. "Oh, it is horrible! Let me think. I must have time to think." Suzanne stood between them, looking at them in another moment of deadly calm. Then, suddenly, even before her brother could catch her, she fell to the floor unconscious. End of chapter 17. Chapter 28 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Epilogue. On Christmas Day, a thick covering of snow lay over the wide stretches of country around Inzersdorf and gave the charm of beauty even to the desolate Black Moor. The Urlach garden was a picture with its snowy spaces of lawn and the trees and bushes sparkling in a covering of many-faceted crystals. In the midst of the white radiance, the handsome old house stood dark in its ivy covering. But there was no longer the gloom of emptiness in its darkness, and the quiet old structure seemed to smile with the gaiety within. For about 2 weeks now, the greenhouse had been again a home. Miss Eva Geringer and her sister lived there, and Mrs. Tunner, with a young serving-maid as assistant, took care of them. That the two sisters had found such a beautiful home was due to Muller. But like many another of his good deeds, he did not consider it anything of importance. It seemed quite natural to him that he should speak of the two forsaken women to Paul Erlock, and the lieutenant thought it equally natural that the woman who might have been his uncle's wife should in her old days at least be an inmate of the home which might have been hers altogether. It was no charity in his eyes, particularly as Eva's sister had undertaken the preparation of Nellie von Feldern's trousseau. The two ladies were to live in the greenhouse for the rest of their lives, thus keeping it open for the young officer and his wife whenever they could make themselves free for a visit to the country. This Christmas Day, every room in the old house was thrown open and a merry company roamed in and out through all its nooks and corners. Colonel von Feldern, Nellie's father, with his wife and younger daughter, had come out for the day with the young couple. Commissioner Lair, Muller, and Karl were also invited. The warm-hearted young officer could not forget those to whom his gratitude was due on this, his first day of hospitality in his heritage. While all was in busy bustling preparation for a hearty Christmas dinner, Muller sat in a corner room, chatting quietly with Miss Eva. His warm heart rejoiced at the look of calm happiness on the pale face of the gentle little invalid. "He's been here several times, then?" he asked. "3 times already," she answered eagerly. "He brought your letter the first time, the letter in which you asked him to come and see us occasionally, and we found him a pleasant visitor." "Then you haven't taken a dislike to him?" asked Muller. "I don't want to make it too much of a sacrifice for you, but your kindness will do the poor man so much good." The invalid smiled sadly as she replied, "For me? How can a poor, worthless cripple like myself feel any superiority over a man who has all his faculties, and a man who does his duty in life so thoroughly well as Mr. Bauer does? No, indeed, we will always be glad to see him, and to do what we can towards banishing his distrust of the world. Besides, he's braver than you think. He did not write his apology to Lieutenant Erlich, but he came in person. But now, Mr. Muller, do tell me about Simarenko and his unfortunate betrothed." Muller sighed deeply. "Miss Suzanne is out of danger now, but I feel she will not shake off the deep sorrow in her heart as quickly as she did the brain fever. Simarenko is safely guarded in the asylum. He has violent moments every now and then, when it takes great force to subdue him, but in his lucid intervals he is very quiet. I went to the asylum to ask about him yesterday, and they tell me that he has spoken of me frequently, spoken of me kindly. Oh, and another thing they told me. When he was brought to the asylum, he had to undergo a physical examination, and it was discovered that he had 3 broken ribs. He acknowledged calmly that they were broken by Gebhardt's blow the night of his attack on the ladder. You remember the story." Yes, you told me. What a terrible man he is, and yet I am sorry for him." "Yes, as am I," said the detective sadly, "to think that just this soul should be darkened by madness." Several years had passed, and the summer was on the land again. A man sat at the window of a great house outside Vienna. There were strong bars at the window, and the door was securely locked. The man was tall but gaunt. His clothes hung loosely from his broad shoulders. His beautiful, supple hands had lost their look of strength, and were almost transparent and waxen. His hair was quite white. After the ravings of the first few terrible weeks, Nikolai Simarenko had been one of the most quiet patients of the asylum. Although kept in the strongest cell under safe watch, he had never attempted an escape. The absolute stillness that seemed to have come over the man made him the most unusual case which the physicians of the institution had ever known. He seemed quite lucid, was again the finely educated, intelligent man of the world, the sympathetic scholar. In spite of the longing for his little girl, which was revealed in an occasional moment, he had expressly asked that Sonia should be kept safely guarded and never allowed to see him. It seemed to make him happy to know that Sonia was in Suzanne's care, being brought up as her own child. The news which came 2 or 3 years after his incarceration, that Suzanne had married, did not distress him. It seemed a relief to him to know that she could overcome the tragedy he had brought into her life. He spoke very little. Most of his time was spent in reading, studying. He was quite contented, but his great physical strength, his magnificent health, were slowly fading. He grew daily thinner and weaker. He has a visitor every now and then, one visitor only. The first time that Muller asked to see Simarenko, he did it hesitatingly, fearing that if the patient would receive him at all, his presence might have a bad effect. But the Russian came to the door to meet him, quite calm, although his eyes were moist. A couple of strong attendants were waiting outside. Watching through a secret peephole, in case the detective should be in danger. But after this first visit he asked that the watching be discontinued, as he knew it was quite unnecessary. Sitting at the window this summer day, Simurenko was awaiting his one friend. Awaiting him impatiently, for he looked out of the window now and then to see if the carriage was not yet in sight. Then he turned to the table in front of him. On it stood 3 photographs. One of them was a picture of his wife, whose fate he took into his own hands, then a portrait of her little daughter, and beside them Suzanne's picture. He gathered them up and locked them away in the drawer, for he did not wish even his one faithful friend to look into this sanctuary of his heart. He did not wish even this one friend to know the hours that he spent in hopeless, torturing longing. Then he went back to the window and stood watching. Finally he heard the wheels of a carriage on the road and the sound of the doorbell. The pale man's eyes brightened, and a faint smile curved his well-cut lips. The end. End of Chapter 18. End of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron.